Chapter 571. Silence. A death-like silence. Perhaps it was very long. Perhaps it was only an instant. Looking back 30 years, looking closer, it was 2 or 3 years. The wood shavings and broken pieces of tables and chairs that had been shattered by the Jinchi all around them fell with a rustle. Blood dripped down. Fan Xian slowly pulled out the sharp sword. The blade scraped against flesh and blood, making a wretched sound. Yi Zhong let go of the pair of iron hands. Gong Dian stood up, coughing up blood. The old Qin master's eyes were wide open. His body was soaked in blood as he sat by the wall. He had died with his eyes open. His hands were slightly open as if he was grabbing onto something. This elder figure of the Qing military had finally died. He had died in the most sinister murder that had been planned and hidden for the longest time since the founding of the Qing kingdom. Fan Xian was not injured at all, but he felt his body become slightly cold. Raising his head, he glanced at the silent Gong Dian to his right with a strange gaze. He looked at the first official of the guards he had met since he entered the capital at the age of 16. It was like he was looking at a monster. Then he turned his head and glanced at Yi Zhong. He looked at Yi Zhong heavily. Coincidentally, Yi Zhong was also looking at him. Their gazes met. There were no sparks, but they each carried a sense of understanding, insight, and probing. Fan Xian knew that, in some sense, his gamble had already completely succeeded. The reason he dared to gamble on the royal palace was not because he already had some inside information. It was because when he had pressed down on the Empress Dowager's foot, he had thought of his grandmother's words in Danzhou. The emperor never fought a battle unprepared. The emperor's willpower was powerful beyond imagination. The emperor did not have any weaknesses. When Fan Xian was faced with a desperate situation, he did not believe that the emperor would not have left any backup in Jingdou. The emperor clearly knew the situation in Jingdou. How could he still go to Dong Mountain to worship heaven? Fan Xian wanted to gamble. He was gambling that some unexpected changes would occur in the rebel army. The changes had finally occurred. The Yi family had rebelled. No, it should be said that the most valiant spies in the history of the Qing kingdom had surfaced. However, when Fan Xian decided to gamble, he still could not convince himself why the Yi family would suddenly intervene, until he saw those things in Yi Zhong's eyes. Perhaps this glance only took a second, but it was enough for Fan Xian to understand many things. In the past, all the questions he had once doubted, all the things in the Qing court that appeared strange these 4 years, which proved the emperor's paranoia and exposed his flaws, all received a perfect explanation. Fan Xian only looked at Yi Zhong for a second, but he had already seen through everything that had happened in the past few years, even more than a decade. A month ago, at the foot of Dong Mountain, Yi Luyun had come in a boat breaking through the waves. A sword came from beyond the heavens. It broke through the rocks and entered the precipice. Only the hilt of the sword remained outside the wall. At that time, Fan Xian was standing on the reef. He had been wounded by an arrow and had luckily escaped by sinking into the sea. Last year in Suzhou in the Baoyue brothel, Yi Luyun arrived wearing a bamboo hat. With one sword he cut down half the building. For the sake of the Juanshan conference, he forcefully took away the accountant. At that moment, Fan Xian let loose a torrent of curses. He suffered internal injuries, but fortunately he did not die. Given Yi Luyun's abilities and the might of a great grandmaster, he had allowed Fan Xian to meet him twice and not die. Using this as a line, it was clear to see the past events of the Qing kingdom. 2 years ago, while admiring chrysanthemums in the Hanging Temple, Gong Dian strangely left his post. There was a sudden assassination aimed at the Qing emperor. The building was in chaos and Fan Xian was heavily injured. Yi Zhong gave chase but failed. The court was shocked and the emperor was furious. He stripped Yi Zhong of his position as commander of the Jingdou garrison and sent him back to Dingzhou. Gong Dian was imprisoned and luckily returned. 2 years and 2 months ago, Fan Xian learned of the marriage between the second prince and Yi Ling-er in Shangjing. He was shocked and thought that the emperor was trying to force Yi Zhong to resign from his post so he would not be involved in the affairs of the princes. From this, it went back to 8 years ago. At that time, Fan Xian was 12. On a cliff in Danzhou, he was bitterly practicing the tyrannical martial method. At that time, the singer Luyun had come and used Sanzhou to compare notes with Wu Zhu. After the Hanging Temple incident, Fan Xian and Qin Pingping had a long night of conversation. They both knew that the emperor had purposely arranged this matter to suppress the Yi family, remove Gong Dian from his position as deputy commander of the imperial army, and force Yi Zhong to leave Jingdou. At the time, he and Qin Pingping were confused. They thought that the emperor was too suspicious, but they also thought that this was a struggle between imperial power and the great grandmasters, so they did not think about it carefully. In dealing with the matter of the Yi family, the Qing emperor had clearly exposed his weakness of being overly suspicious. Although the method he used was obscure, it also lost its righteous style. At this moment, Fan Xian thought of the singer he first met when he was 12. He had long thought through all of this and finally understood. The emperor's paranoia, the emperor's blunder, was purposely showing weakness. Through the alienation of the Yi family, it gave the enemies under heaven the courage to attack. In 8 years, Fan Xian had never seriously thought about why of the 4 great grandmasters, the first one he saw was Yi Luyun. He had also never thought about why Yi Luyun, traveling the world, would go to Danzhou and so easily find Uncle Wu Zhu, whom many people wanted to find but could not. Where was Wu Zhu? No one under heaven knew, but some people knew that wherever Fan Xian was, Wu Zhu would be there. At that time, the only people who knew Fan Xian's true identity were the emperor, Qin Pingping, and Fan Jian. Analyzing to this point, he understood everything. Yi Luyun had gone to Danzhou because someone had told him that Yi Qingmei's son was in Danzhou. Naturally, Wu Zhu was also in Danzhou. The person who had told him all of this was the emperor. In other words, the emperor had solemnly asked Yi Luyun to go to Danzhou and see his illegitimate child with a strange background. Naturally, such a person was the emperor's most trusted person. How could such a person betray the emperor? The emperor's paranoia, the Yi family's alienation, the marriage between the second prince and Yi Ling'er, and Yi Liuyun's sudden change in direction. All of this was actually just an illusion, or perhaps it was a price that had to be paid. These were just the details that made up a perfect infernal affairs. This plan had probably been constructed for a year, 2 years, 3 years. If one thought of Yi Liuyun's identity as a guest of the Juanshan conference, the time this plan had probably begun was more than a dozen years ago. Using such a long time and paying such a heavy price to hide it from everyone under heaven, including himself and the eldest princess's eyes, it could be said that this was the most terrifying infernal affairs in the history of the Qing kingdom. Compared to this, what did the Overwatch Council's Yan Ruahai and Yuan Hongdao count for? In just a second, countless images flashed through Fan Xian's mind. He withdrew his gaze and looked at the calm Yi Zhong. His body suddenly felt a chill as if he had fallen into an ice house. Even Qin Pingping probably did not know of this plan. The emperor's willpower was truly too terrifying. He looked at Yi Zhong. His lips were dry. From his clothes, he took out his special token and handed it over. In a trembling voice he asked, "Is the emperor still alive?" At that moment Yi Zhong was also looking at the young duke. His emotions were complicated. When he had first attacked the old Qin master, he had not thought that Fan Xian on the palace walls would be able to mobilize the power to cooperate with him. His heart was also filled with shock. Had the emperor already told Sir Fan Jr. the entire plan? When Fan Xian opened his mouth, Yi Zhong asked at the same time, "Is the emperor still alive?" The exact same 2 questions shocked Fan Xian and Yi Zhong at the same time. Looking into each other's eyes, they felt a chill. Only now did they know that no one in Jingdo, regardless of whether it was Fan Xian, whom the emperor trusted incomparably, or Yi Zhong, the most important person in this plan, did not know whether the emperor was alive or dead. "Where is Li Yunrui?" Taiping courtyard. The 2 of them stopped talking. Yi Zhong accepted Fan Xian's token. Gong Dian picked up the old Qin master's body and quickly left in the direction of the square, where the sounds of killing had already shaken the heavens. Only a moment had passed since the assassination of Qin Yi. The people involved thought a lot. However, the formal conversation only consisted of these 2 sentences. The first sentence from both sides had already explained too many problems. Everyone was only a pawn in a large chessboard. They just had to do their part. Man proposes, God disposes. For now, they didn't know the situation at Dong Mountain and didn't need to think about it. Fan Xian took a few heavy breaths and forcefully suppressed the irritation brought about by the tyrannical Jinqi and medicine in his body. He dispersed some of the coldness in his heart and did not notice the small hole in the wall. For such a plan, the emperor had planned it for such a long time and exhausted so much energy. Naturally, the plan was great. Eliminating all opposition within the Qin kingdom was one part, but the emperor's true goal was probably far from that. Using Qin Pingping's words, in this world only the emperor stood at the highest and saw the furthest. Given the emperor's gaze during these decades, he had always looked at the beautiful and elegant sights of the world, particularly the lands and people that temporarily did not belong to him. The main target of the Yi family's seamless plan was probably northern Qi and Dongyi. Ku He and Sigu Jian were both present on Dong Mountain, but Yi Luyun was the emperor's underling. The entire situation of the world had probably undergone a world-shaking change on that mountain. However, there were still some things Fan Xian did not understand. Even though Yi Luyun had abruptly turned against him at Dong Mountain, Ku He and Sigu Jian were extraordinary figures. With the 4 great grandmasters at Dong Mountain, even if Ku He and Sigu Jian were at a disadvantage, how could they be taken in by the emperor? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. It looked like the emperor had chosen Dong Mountain as the place to gather the overall situation. Most importantly, he was counting on Uncle Wu Zhu to take action. He knew Uncle Wu Zhu's personality. He would probably disappoint the emperor. The wretched cries of killing came from behind him and pulled him out of his complicated emotions. It reminded him that he was still beside the battlefield. The situation in Jingdo had not been settled. There were still countless people spilling hot blood for a plot that had been woven for many years. He took another deep breath and temporarily stopped thinking about the problem of Dong Mountain. Breaking through the wall, he disappeared into the heavy cover of private residences. In the instant before he moved, he suddenly felt a wave of sorrow. He suddenly felt sympathy for the eldest princess, the crown prince, the second prince, and the Qing soldiers fighting desperately in front of the royal palace. He also began to feel sympathy for himself. For the battle in Jingdo to reach such a level of ferocity, how much damage would it do to the Qing kingdom's national strength? Had the emperor, whose life and death was unknown, really not calculated? The 4 great grandmasters were at Dong Mountain. Even if the power of a sleeve or a finger was enough to shake the heavens and earth, could the emperor still be alive? Why did he take such a great risk and expend so much energy to do such a thing? Was it really to unify the world? Was it just for the title of master of the world? At the same time that Yi Zhong, Gong Jie and Fan Xian were assassinating the old Qin master, the middle-ranking Dingzhou generals, who had been silent the entire time, all met each other's eyes. They saw the determination and confusion in each other's eyes. It was not until the moment they entered the city that these generals had secretly received Commander Yi and General Gong's secret orders. In order to keep it a secret, it was impossible to mobilize the lower-ranking soldiers. However, the Yi family's Dingzhou army had to attack. They had already seen the strange scene in the rebel army's camp. However, soldiers were not robots that only listened to orders. For any army, when they were about to turn on the battlefield without any pre-battle mobilization, they would all appear confused. A moment ago they were preparing to attack the royal palace. In the next moment, they suddenly had to turn their spears toward their own comrades. No matter how strict the military discipline of the Dingzhou army was, their battle power would probably drop to a very low point. Fortunately, the Dingzhou army's outstanding deputy generals and the middle-ranking generals who knew the inside story were talented enough to partially solve the problem of who they were fighting for. They isolated the second prince's trusted aides outside and surrounded the second prince. In a loud voice they yelled, "The second prince has an order. The crown prince has killed the monarch and his father. He is worse than a pig or a dog. Any Qing kingdom soldier can rise up and attack him. Kill." It was not until now that the second prince realized something was wrong. His face immediately paled. He didn't know why these generals, who had always been respectful and courteous, had surrounded him. He also didn't know why they had suddenly given such an absurd military order. Did his father-in-law see that the royal palace had opened and wanted to use this opportunity to get rid of the crown prince and help him ascend the throne? The second prince comforted himself like this in his heart. Only when he saw his trusted aide being shot down by the Dingzhou army and tied up on horseback did his heart grow cold. He knew that a change that neither he nor the crown prince had expected had occurred. Once the military order came out, the common soldiers of the Dingzhou army reacted quickly and attacked the Qin family's troops. Perhaps a portion of them actually believed this military order and thought that the crown prince's assassination plot had finally been exposed. The second prince had learned from his painful experience and decided to avenge the previous emperor. Most of the common soldiers thought that it was the second prince who had decided to take advantage of this opportunity to attack the crown prince. As for the latter judgment, all of the common people seemed to think this way. The attack of all of the Dingzhou soldiers finally succeeded in overcoming the most important problem of military morale among all the defections. Confident, they began to attack the Qin family as a matter of course. Of course, such a hurried defection would not be able to demonstrate the true power of the Dingzhou army. Fortunately, the Qin family still had a large number of soldiers. However, the old Qin master had suddenly died, Qin Heng had been stabbed to death by Jing Ji's spear, and a few generals had escorted the crown prince to the back of the camp. Of the 8 generals on the front lines, 5 had been killed and 3 wounded. It could truly be said that they were a group of dragons without a leader. For an army with slightly more stable morale to attack an army without a leader to command them, victory or defeat was not difficult to predict. On the chaotic battlefield, other than the Dingzhou army, not many people heard the military orders of the Yi family generals. There were still many people fighting with all their might. Even if it wasn't to kill the enemy, it was to protect their own lives. Covered in blood, the great prince brandished the long knife in his hand and opened a bloody path. Although he was unable to charge into the rebel army's camp, he successfully met up with the remaining Black Knights. In the fierce battle, he did not see the scene of Fan Xian Yizhong and Gong Yan attacking at the same time. He thought he had reached the end of his road. Fresh blood dripped from his hand, but his expression was solemn. As a prince of the Qin kingdom, he had fought for the royal palace until now without a glimmer of regret in the depths of his heart. A thunderous sound of horse hooves rang out. The Dingzhou cavalry, which had been resting, finally charged over. The great prince narrowed his eyes slightly and glanced at the already exhausted Jinggu. Tightening the knife hilt in his hand, he was about to chop down. However, the Dingzhou cavalry swept past in front of them and did not attack at all. Instead, they charged ruthlessly toward the Qin family army. Kill? Chapter 572. The sound of killing shook the sky. Suddenly and without any warning, countless riders covered in Dingzhou dust began to attack the Qin family from all directions in the square. A group of about 1,000 cavalrymen, like a sickle, sharply swept across the royal palace. The scaling ladders that towered up to the top of the royal palace were, in a flash, like ripe grains in a paddy field. With a crash, they were neatly cut off at the root. The ears of wheat were always heavy. There were a number of rebel soldiers bravely climbing up the scaling ladders. They had no idea that friendly soldiers would attack them from below. The defenses at the bottom of the scaling ladders had not considered this problem. So many three-part scaling ladders collapsed miserably from the two sides toward the center. The rebel soldiers on them cried out wretchedly as they fell from high above like grains falling from a harvest. Many people fell to their deaths on the ground, spilling out blood and internal organs. They were then pressed to the bottom by the layers of scaling ladders that randomly fell to the ground like rice stalks. The rebel soldiers who had already reached the palace walls suddenly felt something strange behind them and couldn't help but feel shocked. On the contrary, the remaining Imperial Army and Overwatch Council subordinates in the palace walls discovered that the situation on the battlefield below had suddenly changed and found their last chance of survival. Courage immediately surged into their chests. The people defending the royal palace charged forward and surrounded the rebel soldiers who had reached the palace walls, forcing the Qin family soldiers, who no longer had a path of retreat, into a hopeless situation. There were already rebel soldiers breaking through the front doors of the royal palace and carrying out a sudden attack. They had no idea what was happening behind them. The Yi family's two groups of riders approached from the west in Taiping Square. After sweeping through the scaling ladders, they did not slow down at all. They rode directly into the pitch-black front doors of the royal palace and launched an attack behind the rebel soldiers entering the palace. On the square, the Dingzhou army, which had taken an advantageous position, had long begun their counterattack against the Qin family. Too many of the Qin family's upper-level generals had died or been injured. Additionally, the incident had happened suddenly. For a moment, they were unable to organize an effective defense or counterattack. On the battlefield, what decided victory or defeat was often the moment the battle began. The generals of the Dingzhou army carried out the secret order the commander had given them before they entered the city. With a thunderous force, they attacked and caught the Qin family's army unprepared. For a moment, the rebel soldiers suffered heavy casualties. The scales of victory and defeat had already tipped toward the Dingzhou army. As for why the scales were tipped, that was something that not everyone could understand. This was especially so for the Imperial Army and Shadow Cavalry in the center of the square. They had already gone through 4 hours of desperate fighting and were extremely exhausted. Seeing that they were about to face death, their eyes were wide open and they were clearly at a loss. The great prince, covered in blood, stood together with Jinggu, who had his head lowered. They looked in shock at the murderous cries around them, the black smoke, the light of the knife, and the shadow of the sword. They listened to the grunts, wretched wails, and sorrowful cries in the square. They discovered that the long knife in their hands was actually very heavy. The rebel army suddenly began to attack each other. The Qin family was unable to protect themselves, and the Dingzhou army purposely avoided the area in the middle of the square. The great prince and the people protecting the royal palace stood in a daze on the empty ground, not understanding what had happened. A moment ago they were still fighting with their lives on the line. In the next moment they seemed to have become pure spectators. What happened in Jingdo seemed to have nothing to do with them. The great prince glanced at the wounded Jinggu at his side and furrowed his brows. As the commander of the Western Expedition Army, he knew how important one's reaction on the battlefield was. Regardless of what problems were happening within the rebel army, if he wanted to use this opportunity, he had to immediately give the order to gather the nearly 2,000 remaining effective forces inside and outside the palace. However, there was a loss in his eyes because the inside and outside of the palace had already been divided into a number of battle zones. It was impossible for the imperial army to band together. Furthermore, from the bottom of his heart, the great prince did not want these exhausted subordinates to once again leave this rare moment of safety and throw themselves into the flames of battle. Thus, he had to see clearly what the Dingzhou army's sudden betrayal meant. Did the second prince want to use this opportunity to get rid of the crown prince and take the throne himself? But why did the Dingzhou army purposely stay away from the imperial army and work hard to protect the royal palace? He suddenly thought of everything Fan Xian had done since the early hours of the morning. His heart thumped. Did Fan Xian know that the Yi family would make a move? Was that why he had sent out those orders to find a good opportunity for the other party? At this moment, a member of the Imperial Guard rushed to his side and whispered a few words into his ear. He briefly explained what had happened in the rebel army's camp that someone had noticed earlier. The great prince's eyes lit up slightly. He looked at the Dingzhou army shuttling around him, the Qin family troops retreating step by step not far away, and the dragon flag where the crown prince was. He finally relaxed a little. His admiration for Fan Xian grew a little stronger. Urgent military orders rang out from all around them. Amidst the dust and smoke filling the air, the powers of all sides gathered and charged. The great prince led the remaining 200 people and the imperial soldiers who had returned from Taiping Square. Fortunately, they met up together and slowly pressed toward the royal palace. In the distance, hidden by the dust and smoke, the bright yellow dragon flag could faintly be seen leaving the square. The entire square had become a battlefield of carnage. Although the Qin family's rebel army had suffered heavy casualties, they had more people than the Dingzhou army. Although the military orders did not go their way, they still made the Dingzhou army pay a great price by relying on the Qing army's naturally outstanding individual soldier qualities. The scene was chaotic. All of the Qing soldiers had become countless small battle groups and were fighting together. This situation had arisen because, at the very beginning, the Dingzhou army had received the crown prince's edict and was prepared to change formations with the Qin family. This created the chaos. Along the line of the royal palace, there were battles happening on all sides. People were dying everywhere and there were wretched cries everywhere. The autumn sun hung high in the sky and finally pierced through the smoke around the royal palace, illuminating everything clearly. Blood flowed all over the ground, particularly where there was a moat on 3 sides of the royal palace. The blood had already seeped into the river. Many of the dead and wounded soldiers also fell miserably into the river. Some of the rebel soldiers who had not completely died were soaked in the cold moat water and woke up. However, they were powerless to struggle ashore. Wretchedly and powerlessly, they sank into the river. It looked like there were countless water ghosts in the moat pulling at their ankles. Faced with the Dingzhou army's sudden attack, the Qin family managed to hold out for a while before finally retreating in defeat. A few generals protected the crown prince and led the group that had gathered back away from the square. Following the streets of Jingdou, they began to retreat toward the city gate guards that the rebel soldiers still controlled. The dragon flag retreated, and the army lost again. The Dingzhou army cried out in unison and charged forward bravely. Immediately, the battlefield once again spread from the 3 li around the royal palace toward Jingdou. Chasing and being chased, killing and being killed, arrows flew wildly and knives and spears struck out viciously. All of Jingdou began to tremble. They knew that they would face an upheaval and bloodbath that had not been seen in 16 years. Thud, thud, thud. A series of heavy horse hooves cut through the remaining smoke on the ground. With the general on the horse, they appeared in front of the imperial army and black knights below the royal palace in this corner that seemed to have been forgotten by the rebel army. Countless sounds of metal colliding rang out. No one gave an order. There was no need for an order. These exhausted imperial soldiers and black knights, who had suffered heavy casualties, suddenly exploded with spirit. They quickly changed their formation and surrounded the general and the soldiers behind him. The expressions of the soldiers behind the general changed dramatically. They all drew their knives from their sheaths. The great prince slowly walked out. Looking at the familiar figure on the horse, he furrowed his brows and maintained his silence. Yizhong slowly raised his right arm. The dozens of soldiers slowly put away their knives with wary expressions. However, they still nervously watched the remaining soldiers who had once given them countless mental blows. Earlier, on the square, these hundreds of riders had charged twice and thrown the rebel army into chaos. Spears pointed at Qin Heng and knives cut through tens of thousands of soldiers. It was truly terrifying. I will move 3,000 soldiers to help your highness defend the city. Yi Zhong looked at the blood-covered great prince in front of him. A glimmer of admiration flashed through his eyes, but his tone remained calm. Gong Dian will arrive immediately. He will help your highness control the situation. The great prince looked at him and still did not speak. Yi Zhong had already reached into his clothes and took out a token. He tossed it toward the great prince from a distance. The great prince raised his aching right arm and caught it. Looking closely, he saw that it was the token that Fan Xian had taken from his subordinate in the early hours of the morning. He involuntarily furrowed his brows. Raising his head to look at Yi Zhong's steady figure on the horse, he asked, "Father?" He only said 2 words before Yi Zhong interrupted him. He knew what the great prince wanted to ask, but he had no idea how to answer. There were no idiots in the royal family. When Yi Zhong revealed his identity and had Fan Xian's token as a keepsake, the great prince was already certain of Yi Zhong's role in this rebellion. He also knew that a figure of Yi Zhong's level was not someone that Fan Xian could persuade. It could only be said that before his father left the capital, he had already made arrangements for the Dingzhou soldiers who had pretended to come forward to offer up prisoners of war. The great prince took a deep breath and didn't say anything more. He directly gave the order, "Give chase." He knew that Yi Zhong was waiting for his order. Although the Qin family had already been defeated and the sounds of killing still lingered in the square, the Yi family's Dingzhou army had, in reality, already controlled the entire situation in Jingdou. Yet Yi Zhong still wanted to see him. He needed him, the commander of the imperial army, the eldest son of the royal family, to give Yi Zhong an order. Given the current situation, the power in his hands already allowed Yi Zhong to control Jingdou. However, he didn't want and didn't dare let anyone have this kind of speculation after the fact, so he was particularly respectful toward the great prince. The flames of war had already spread into Jingdou. Unavoidably, it affected the commoners who had closed their doors for a day and night. There were tragic battles happening everywhere. The Dingzhou cavalry had already chased after the Qin family's main camp toward the 9 city gates of Jingdou. However, the crown prince was not below the dragon flag. This young man, who was about to break into the royal palace and become the new monarch of the Qin kingdom, had suddenly been struck across the waist. His dream had been shattered in front of his eyes. His expression had long become ghastly. Fortunately, the Qin family's loyal generals reacted quickly and led the remaining soldiers to carve out a bloody path. Li Qingqian didn't want to retreat because he knew that he only had the Qin family's army in his hands. If he left Jingdou, although the world was large, where would he find shelter? Probably even his aunt had not thought that the Yi family would betray him. A bitter smile rose to the corners of the young crown prince's lips. The jolting of the warhorse beneath him did not cause his frozen expression to change at all. Earlier, he had been thinking about how to win the Yi family over from the side of the second prince after he ascended the throne and become a true emperor. He was also thinking about how to resist the pressure of his aunt, mother, grandmother, and old Qin master and pardon the civil officials on the city walls who were determined to oppose him, particularly the scholars Shu and Hu. Who would have thought that the Yi family would betray him like this? His aunt probably still didn't know this shocking news. His mother and grandmother were still trapped on the city walls, and the old Qin master was already dead. The crown prince felt a sharp pain in his chest. He almost couldn't stand straight on his horse. At his side, a rebel general said with tears in his eyes, "Your Highness, as long as we get out of the city and gather soldiers, Shao Mountain, and our people, we can charge straight north and meet up with Governor Yan. The matter will definitely succeed." These words were reasonable, but Li Qingqian didn't really believe it. Fan Xian had returned alive, Governor Yan was probably also dead. Since the Yi family had betrayed, great-uncle Lu Yun was probably... Li Qingqian sighed in his heart. Following the horse toward the city gates, he didn't know what kind of waves were surging in his heart. Below the city walls, one of the main conspirators of the rebellion, the second prince, was looking at his father-in-law with a venomous and hopeless gaze. Before Yi Zhong personally led the Dingzhou army in pursuit, for some reason, he had returned to his camp and glanced at his son-in-law. "If you want to live, you have to remember everything the Dingzhou army said today." The second prince's entire body was restrained. He stood wretchedly under his horse. He raised his head and looked fiercely at Yi Zhong as he spat. He knew what Yi Zhong's words meant. The Dingzhou army's final betrayal was nominally because he wanted to avenge his father and carry out his father's posthumous edict. However, he knew that was not the case. Of all the people involved, the one who felt the most hopeless, shocked, and angry was the second prince. He had no idea that on Dong Mountain, the Qing emperor had specifically said to Fan Xian that if possible, he should leave the second prince alive. At such a moment, the second prince had never thought he could survive. What made him most angry was that he seemed to have planned for a long time. In the end, he was the stupidest person. Everything that he had done now seemed so ridiculous, so comical. His eyes were filled with anger. His usually gentle expression appeared particularly dark and cold. "Father-in-law, you are truly a good dog. However, if father truly dies, what will you do?" Yi Zhong didn't say anything. He slowly turned his horse around. The expression on his face became somewhat dim. Behind him, the second prince yelled, "You bunch of liars!" At this moment, a heavy object suddenly fell from above the royal palace walls and struck viciously against the hard stone tiles with a muffled thud. The person who fell was wearing beautiful and luxurious clothing. Having suffered such a heavy blow, all the bones in her body were broken. Blood flowed freely. She had long died. However, her head was perfectly preserved, revealing a dignified and haggard face filled with despair and madness. Chapter 573. Writing the first few chapters was too exhausting. These 2 days have made me tired. I need to take a break. Looking at the Empress body on the ground and the pool of flesh and blood, everyone was shocked speechless. Yi Zhong said a few words in a low voice. He then turned his horse around and began to chase toward the city gate. The Qin family's strength was still very powerful. He had to quickly communicate with the soldiers in all directions and attack to the end. Secondly, the Empress had died in front of him. For his own safety, it was best to hide as far away as possible. It was best to leave the matters of the royal family to the great prince and the Duke of Dambois to handle. The Empress' suicide as she fell from the city gate was outside of many people's expectations. Although the Crown Prince's army had been defeated and the Empress' fate would not be good, no one had thought that the outwardly gentle but inwardly useless Empress would, in the last moment of her life, summon such courage. At this time, the killing on the palace walls had not ended. The Qin family's rebel army was still stubbornly resisting. Fan Xian and the great prince's trusted subordinates were concerned about the Empress Dowager and officials' safety. They also did not ignore the Empress' existence. However, they did not have the extra energy to guard against the mournful leap. The Empress jumped down and died in front of tens of thousands of people. This scene was shocking to the core. The second prince stared at the Empress' body in a daze like an idiot. Suddenly, he began to tremble from the tips of his toes to the top of his head. His entire body was enveloped by coldness as he trembled endlessly. He didn't know what kind of end he was about to face. Unconsciously, he raised his head and looked. After confirming that his birth mother, Lady Shu, was safe, he collapsed to the ground. At his side, Dingzhou soldiers had already helped him up. Respectfully and warily, they surrounded him in the center, terrified that something would happen to him. The second prince's face was expressionless, but his gaze was unfocused. He thought to himself, things have already gotten to this point. If someone wants to die, who can stop them? The Qin family's army had already retreated. The Dingzhou army continued to give chase. Jingdo was filled with the sounds of killing, particularly the group of rebel soldiers with the dragon flag. They moved with extraordinary speed through the long streets, passed by Jingyang Gate, which Zhang Diqing personally guarded, and sped out of Jingdo. Zhang Diqing's face was ashen as he watched the scene in front of him. He didn't know what he was feeling. Loyalty was a belief that needed to be upheld for a lifetime. Even if it wavered at the last moment, the loyalty of the first half of his life would become a foundation for treachery. He knew he had no chance to turn things around. He also didn't have the courage to use the 3,000 soldiers of the City Gate Department and the 9 city gates to help the Qin family slow the Dingzhou army. The city gates could only guard against the people outside the city. How could they guard against the people inside? Zhang Diqing let out a long gloomy sigh. He took one last look at Jingyang Gate, which seemed to flash with a golden light under the blazing sunlight. He led his personal guards, followed the dragon flag and followed the rebel army as they began to flee. Jingyang Gate didn't even have time to close when the Dingzhou army led by Gong Dian charged over. Turning into a yellow dragon, they gave chase. The fleeing crown prince used the dragon flag as a smokescreen. He was surrounded and protected by the few remaining generals of the Qin family as he arrived at Donghua Gate. The old Qin master and Qin Hung were both dead. At this moment, the rebel army was like a group of dragons without a leader. Fortunately, the family generals the old Qin master had sent to protect the crown prince were still alive. At such a critical moment, they had thought of this escape method. They intended to leave the capital and head north to meet up with the northern expedition camp in Sangzhou. However, the crown prince's heart had long become dim. Since there was foreshadowing in the capital, perhaps Governor Yen was already dead. Where could he escape to? He still didn't know that his mother had fallen to the city walls and died. He took a deep breath and forcefully raised his spirits a moment later. He thought to himself that if his father had truly died, with his aunt's help, he might be able to rise again. After all, he was the crown prince. The world was named Li and not Fan. Even if he controlled Jingdo, he might not be able to control the world. However, the glimmer of fighting spirit that he had raised with great difficulty was instantly shattered by the two tightly shut city gates in front of him. The crown prince and the generals looked with ashen faces at the city gate guards waiting with arrows on the stone steps on either side of Donghua Gate. They looked at the white-clothed official beside the general and their hearts tightened. The crown prince recognized the white-clothed official. He knew that he was the third-ranking figure in the Overwatch Council, Yan Bingyun, whom his father greatly admired. However, he had already received news that when he was trying to convince Zhang Diqing, he had already been taken down by his aunt's people and rescued by someone else. How had he come here? Crown Prince, please wait. Yan Bingyun's white robes were still stained with blood from Ling Chen's fatal attack. He coughed with a serious expression. After the black-clothed man who had saved his life placed him in a safe area, he had disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he had gone. Yan Bingyun was unable to personally participate in the events that happened in Jingdo during this half a day. Through one of the remaining channels he watched everything nervously. When there was a strange movement in the square, he had already arrived at Donghua Gate. No Yamen was united. Even if Zhang Diqing had been the commander of the city gate guards for 20 years, it was impossible for him to command all of his subordinates to be of the same mind in today's situation, especially when the rebel army had been defeated. Yan Bingyun knew he was taking a risk, but he liked the feeling of taking risks. Furthermore, he felt that after making a big mistake, he had to make up for something and do something for Sir Fan Jr. Fortunately, he succeeded this time. The city gate guards successfully blocked the crown prince at Donghua Gate. The emperor's strict control over the city gate guards made the commander of Donghua Gate stand firmly by Fan Xian's side after learning the specific situation. Perhaps he stood on the side of his own glory, splendor, and wealth. If the crown prince was allowed to lead his troops out of Jingdo and contact the soldiers in the wilderness, who knew what changes would happen in the future? The rebel army wholeheartedly wanted to break out of the city and did not give Yan Bingyun much time to negotiate. Without asking the crown prince, the generals of the Qin family began to prepare for battle. Hearing a military order, the rebel army bravely charged toward Donghua Gate. Arrows flew in unison from both sides and there were heavy casualties. Not long after the battle began, the crown prince's face paled. He heard a thunderous roar coming from behind him. It was the Dingzhou cavalry. A flag fluttered in the wind in the streets of Jingdo and quickly approached Donghua Gate. There was a large Yi written on the flag. Yi Zhong had personally led the troops here. To his surprise, he found that Donghua Gate was already closed. The rebel army the crown prince was in was blocked in front of the not-so-wide city gate. Densely packed, they took up half the main street. He took a deep breath. He knew that Donghua Gate could not be held for much longer. Raising his right arm, he prepared to carry out the bloodiest part of the Jingdo incident. He had not expected that the rebel army's violent attack on Donghua Gate would gradually slow. After Yi Zhong caught up, the crown prince's head had been lowered the entire time, resting on his chest. No one knew what he was thinking. Then he slowly raised his head. His eyes were filled with a dimness and relief. He opened his mouth and said, "Surrender." Everyone fell silent. They looked at the crown prince with disbelief, anger, grief, hopelessness, and confusion. They didn't know why he had suddenly lost all will to fight. The crown prince's gaze slowly swept across the faces of the generals and soldiers who followed him loyally. He knew that if he fought to the death, it was not impossible for him to kill his way out of the city. However, this matter had progressed to this point. The crown prince was tired, and hopeless. So what if he killed his way out of the city? From Jingdo to Sangzhou was thousands of li away. Was he going to let these thousands of soldiers die one by one in this endless pursuit? Was he going to let the army fight, kill, and set fire to the fertile land of the Qin people? The crown prince turned his horse's head and looked at Yi Zhong in the distance through the forest of spears that filled the street. "General Yi, I don't want to leave." Yi Zhong furrowed his brows slightly. He didn't understand why the scene in front of him had occurred. No matter what, he would never have guessed the change in the crown prince's mentality. He always thought the crown prince had other thoughts. Since the crown prince had spoken, it seemed that there was a chance. Yi Zhong didn't want his Dingzhou army to pay even more casualties. Your Highness is wise. Li Qingxian's position as crown prince had already been stripped by Fan Xian in the palace. However, Yi Zhong still said it out of habit. Li Qingxian laughed bitterly and then said, I have a condition. Please speak, crown prince. I want to see Fan Xian. He must promise me one thing. Li Qingxian's face immediately became cold. It wasn't because he understood something. As a son of the Li family, as the crown prince who had been raised as the next ruler for many years, he faintly guessed what kind of fate the hand in the sky wanted to mold in Jingdo. He didn't want to submit to that fate. At the very least, he wanted the hand to be hit by some small pebbles when it was molding clay figurines. Yi Zhong was silent for a moment. He then said, I don't know where Duke Fan is right now. A strange light flashed through Li Qingxian's eyes. He immediately guessed something. His expression became ugly. He began to worry about the safety of certain people. He thought to himself that his condition had not yet fallen into Fan Xian's ears. Would it be too late? Yi Zhong was lying because he could guess where Fan Xian was. In Jingdo, which had basically become a sea of blood, regardless of whether it was the rebel soldiers or the people who had accepted Fan Xian's power as regent, they had all lost track of him. Ever since the old Qin master was assassinated, Duke Fan, who was in charge of Jingdo's affairs, could no longer be found. The crown prince, who had made up his mind in front of Donghua Gate, guessed Fan Xian's whereabouts at the first instant. Yi Zhong was able to guess it because he had personally told Fan Xian the address. The crown prince was able to guess it because he cared deeply about everything there and the people there. Fan Xian was in Taiping Courtyard. Dressed in black, he stood on one side of Lujing River and looked at the scenery on the other side. His entire person merged into the shadows of the trees. If one didn't look carefully, it was impossible to see him. This was already the outskirts of Jingdo. After he killed Qin Yi, he had used his fastest speed to take advantage of the chaos in Jingdo to cross the tall city walls and come here. In this royal courtyard were his wife Lin Wan'er, who he cared about the most, De Bao, and the eldest princess, who had single-handedly planned the Dong Mountain incident and the Jingdo rebellion. Fan Xian was not unfamiliar with Taiping Courtyard. More accurately, he was extremely familiar with it. This manor had been his family's property 20 years ago. It was where his mother Yi Qingmei had lived after coming to the Qin kingdom. After the Yi family was destroyed, this manor had been taken back by the royal family. However, the emperor had always sealed up Taiping Courtyard and used internal guards to watch it, forbidding any member of the royal family from entering. Only then did its reputation gradually disappear. During the summer and autumn of the 4th year of the Qin calendar, Fan Xian had once taken his sister to look across the river. At that time the river wind caressed their bodies, making them sigh. Fan Xian didn't understand why the eldest princess would choose Taiping Courtyard as her residence for directing Jingdo matters. At this moment he had no time to think about this. How to safely rescue Wan'er and De Bao was the most important thing. Although Wan'er was the eldest princess' own daughter, Fan Xian could not guarantee that after personally seeing so many years of planning come to such a tragic end, that crazy woman wouldn't become unrecognizable to her own family. During these 10 days he had always known what kind of situation Wan'er was in, but he still had no way to solve it. He also did not reveal a glimmer of worry in front of others. Only he knew how Wan'er and De Bao's safety affected his emotions. Standing on this side of the river and looking at the other side, Fan Xian's heart throbbed slightly. Only now did he understand that Wan'er was more important in his heart than he had imagined. Wu Zhu had once personally told him about the layout of the rooms in Taiping Courtyard. Furthermore, Wu Zhu had once gone deep into the courtyard to retrieve something. After Fan Xian came to the other side of the courtyard, he carefully examined the defenses of the quiet and secluded courtyard. It was much weaker than he had imagined. It looked like the Overwatch Council and his ceaseless attacks on Xinjiang these years had indeed had some effect. The aces by the eldest princess side had been greatly reduced. While the sounds of killing shook the heavens in Jingdo, the Taiping Courtyard on the outskirts of the capital was completely silent. This sharp contrast made it so that Fan Xian did not dare to move lightly. When Taiping Courtyard was first built, its location was special. It was actually built on a small peninsula in the middle of Lujing River. There was only one passageway into the courtyard. The surrounding riverbanks were all relatively lower and shallower. Fan Xian observed for a long time from the treetops and branches. He found that his line of sight was blocked by the courtyard walls. It was impossible to see the situation inside. The design of the courtyard walls was very clever. It was not very high, but it just so happened to block all the lines of sight from the outside. Fan Xian's lips tasted bitter. He knew that even if he brought in a sniper rifle, it would not be of much use. Thinking of this, his heart couldn't help but thump. He thought to himself, when my mother designed this courtyard, did she ever think of defending against a sniper rifle? However, there was no courtyard in the world that could not be attacked. Otherwise, the Yi girl would not have disappeared from the Qin kingdom 20 years ago. Fan Xian was just a bit afraid of harming the innocent. He didn't attack forcefully because he knew that Li Yunrui's move had indeed caught him where it hurt. He didn't think for long on this side of the river. Fan Xian's expression calmed. Taking a deep breath, he turned toward a bridge in the bamboo that he had once passed. Like he was taking a stroll, he walked to the front door of Taiping Courtyard. Behind the bamboo forest on the wall, many people suddenly appeared and surrounded Fan Xian in the center. These were the eldest princess' personal guards. They looked at him with faces full of shock. They had long recognized his identity and didn't understand why he would appear like this at such a time. Chapter 574. Fan Xian stood at the door of Taiping Courtyard and looked sideways at the faint green in the courtyard. After he said those words, he didn't say another word. A dozen aces from Xinjiang looked at him with faces full of astonishment. They didn't know what had happened in Jingdo. How could this commissioner of the Overwatch Council, who should have been trapped in the royal palace, suddenly appear in front of Taiping Courtyard's door? A gust of wind blew through the bamboo forest, calmly and faintly removing some of the heat around them. The Xinjiang aces gave a low cry and charged toward Fan Xian. Fan Xian furrowed his brows and retreated. His left arm seemed to be able to twist and strike out. His fist, which had reached its limit, suddenly opened. Like an old tree opening its leaves, it slapped the side of an ace's face with a slap. Although it didn't land, it still made half of the ace's teeth fall out. Fresh blood flowed as he fell to the ground and fainted. Fan Xian stood on the tips of his toes. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body surged out. His entire body shrunk. Like a faint shadow, he charged backward out of the encirclement. Looking at the people who gritted their teeth and charged over, his eyes became even more bloodshot. His hands trembled slightly. Just as he had said to Sir Yan Jr. when he first set the time, the present Jingdo was basically an empty city for Fan Xian. The most powerful figures in the world that could threaten him had all been attracted to Dong Mountain by the emperor. Regardless of whether it was the Northern Qi aces or the numbing 9th-level swordsmen in Dongyi, they were all attracted by that jade-like mountain like a magnet. There were only 3 9th-level aces in Jingdo. The old Qin master was already dead, and Yi Zhong was on his side. Fan Xian had confidence that as long as he didn't sink into a chaotic army, who could kill him. However, he had no way of knowing Wan Er and De Bao's whereabouts, so he didn't attack forcefully. Thus, he gambled again and came outside Taiping Courtyard to knock on the door. Perhaps this was a bit arrogant, but it was actually a kind of helplessness. Faced with the eldest princess's methods, even someone as dark and ruthless as Fan Xian could only temporarily shed his tyrannical nature and find another way. However, these Xinjiang aces did not know that Sir Fan Jr. was preparing to attack with words. Amidst their shock, they attacked with all their strength. In just one exchange, someone was heavily injured. No one knew what kind of bloody battle would follow. The aces charging toward Fan Xian suddenly stopped their steps. The crossbows sticking out of the walls of Taiping Courtyard also raised their arrowheads and no longer pointed at Fan Xian. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the crossbow bolts. He couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. However, there were always too many helpless things in life. If he wanted Wan Er and De Bao to be safe, he could only lean toward the Tiger Mountain in front of him. No one stopped Fan Xian from entering the courtyard again. Countless eyes watched his every move, whether openly or secretly. If he reacted in the slightest, the real attack would probably begin. Because at this time, from the Taiping Courtyard came an extremely elegant and faint sound of a zither. The sound was like the gurgling of flowing water, calming one's heart and mind, causing those who heard it to feel uneasy and at ease. Since the princess had already given the order through the sound of the guqin, the aces throughout Taiping Courtyard would no longer stop Fan Xian from entering. However, they had endless questions in their hearts. Why did the princess want Fan Xian to enter? Did she not know how terrifying Fan Xian was? Why didn't she take advantage of the fact that Fan Xian had come alone to kill him in one blow? A dozen people slowly escorted or watched Fan Xian into the front door of Taiping Courtyard. They then stopped in front of the second bridge. In front of them was a forbidden area. Without the eldest princess's personal order, no one was allowed to enter. Fan Xian stood in front of the bridge and lowered his head to look at the wooden planks on the bridge. There were gaps between the planks through which he could see the clear river water below. The section of Lujing River in Taiping Courtyard was separated by a stone path to the island. It formed a pool of slow water like a level lake. The surface of the water seemed to be forever still and would not flow. The quiet and peaceful sound of the zither came from the inner courtyard across the bridge and gently entered his ears. He lowered his head to look at the flowing water and tilted his ear to listen to the sound of the zither. It was as if he wanted to judge the current state of mind of the player. A moment later, he carefully tidied his clothes and stepped onto the bridge. Walking steadily to the island, he pushed open the wooden door to the inner courtyard and raised his eyes to look calmly at the woman gently stroking the strings of the zither under the pavilion by the lake in the center of the island. Raising his hands, he bowed respectfully and said, "Greetings, Your Highness." The sound of the zither did not stop at all because of this sudden greeting. That pair of slender fingers and white wrists plucked and stroked on the zither. It was still very steady. Li Yunrui lowered her head slightly. It was as if she was putting all of her attention on the 7 strings of the zither in front of her. However, her wrist lowered slightly. Her fingertips slid to the right end. Compared to the quiet sound earlier, the sound of the zither seemed even more reserved and elegant. The little lake in the center of the island was rippled by the autumn wind. The stones by the lake were green and contrasted beautifully with the short, shallow hill around them. There was a pavilion on the hill, but the person and the zither were not in the pavilion. Instead, they were under a flowering tree. The stamens of the flowers on the tree were a faint pink. No one knew what they were called. The autumn wind ruffled the green pond and brushed against the tops of the flowering trees. The water moved and petals fell like rain. They landed on the eldest princess' wide-sleeved ancient robes like a slightly darker flower shadow. Fan Xian looked quietly in that direction. He looked at Li Yunrui's calm and indifferent face that still could not hide its charm. Today the eldest princess had not put on grand makeup. She had only slightly raised the tips of her brows, but her natural and romantic aura filled the entire garden. A head of beautiful black hair fell behind her shoulders. She had only used a silk handkerchief to pull it up behind her head. It made her appear even more elegant and at ease. She was playing the zither with her head lowered. Her eyelids were slightly lowered. Her long eyelashes gently rested on her jade-like skin. It made Fan Xian involuntarily think of the pair of eyes his wife had inherited from her. If one didn't know who she was and didn't purposely think of her age, then any man would have to admit this woman's charm. Fan Xian walked along the green stones by the lakeside. He narrowed his eyes slightly in the sound of the zither. He then opened his mouth and said, "Yin Xiaoyi is dead." The sound of the zither continued to hum softly. Occasionally, it would rise and make a few vibrating sounds to show that she had long known of this matter and didn't need to say more. "Qin Heng is dead," Fan Xian said quietly as he stared at her hands. 2 fingers of Li Yunrui's right hand slid across the 4th string and pressed it a few times. The zither under her fingers made a leisurely sound. Fan Xian didn't hesitate for a moment. His plain and powerful words pressed forward. "Qin Yi is also dead." Li Yunrui still did not raise her head. The speed at which the 7 strings of the zither moved became slower and slower. It gradually became more sorrowful. However, the zither was elegant and light. It was sorrowful but not hurtful. The light thoughts of separation could be seen clearly. However, in the slight trembling of the wide sleeves behind her hands, it was faintly possible to capture the eldest princess's emotions. Suddenly, the sound of the zither rose again. However, the sound of the zither had always been deep and elegant. No matter how fast the fingers moved, the range of the sound was always limited within that range. The playing, which should have been filled with hostility, used a slowness that was completely different from the speed to declare Yongjing's sense of purity. Only those who were confident could play the correct sound. Fan Xian had already walked under the flowering trees and to her side. He lowered his head to look at the undulating strings like waves. Suddenly he said, "People call me a scholar, but I actually know nothing about music. I'm afraid the thoughts you used for me are like playing the lute to a cow." Li Yunrui had probably never heard of playing the lute to a cow. She continued to lower her head and stroked the strings, intoxicated and unconcerned. She didn't know who she was playing this song to. It just so happened that Fan Xian had come to Taiping at this time. Fan Xian was thick-skinned and never knew what bashfulness was. Seeing that she was ignoring him, he smiled self-mockingly and sat down beside the eldest princess. He then looked at the side of her face and said very naturally, "Yi Zhong has betrayed us." The sound of the zither suddenly became chaotic. With a muffled hum, it rose in spirals and spread through the green hills and flowering trees by the lake. The zither struggled and 3 of them broke. The eldest princess slowly raised her head and looked into Fan Xian's eyes. It only took a moment for her to recover her calm emotions. She said, "Every time I see you it seems that I don't hear any good news." Although the eldest princess and Fan Xian had stood on their own sides and endlessly fought and clashed, their struggle ran through the major events of the Qin court these few years. Strangely enough, Fan Xian and she had only seen each other a few times. This pair had become each other's greatest enemies, but they were actually not very familiar with each other. "If you want to hear good news, then following the good news should be my head," Fan Xian said quietly to the eldest princess. Fan Xian spoke quietly to the eldest princess. His gaze casually swept around. Unfortunately, he did not discover anything. His gaze dimmed slightly for a moment. At this time, the eldest princess's hands were quietly stroking the broken strings of the zither. Her eyes were slightly closed, and her originally extremely pale complexion seemed even whiter at this moment, even becoming transparent. The usual alluring blush was nowhere to be seen. Fan Xian's sudden appearance in Taiping courtyard was indeed beyond her expectations. This was because Fan Xian had moved too quickly. The people she had left in the rebel army had not had time to report the specific situation in Jingdo. She had already faintly sensed that something was wrong, so she didn't attack Fan Xian at the first opportunity. Instead, she had him come in and see how the latter half of the story happened. Furthermore, she held Fan Xian's life in her hands, so she didn't care at all what kind of extraordinary abilities this son-in-law had. However, Fan Xian's 4 consecutive facts made the eldest princess's state of mind finally relax. Although she had guessed Yin Xiaoyi's death long after Fan Xian had appeared in Jingdo, she couldn't help but feel slightly gloomy now that she had personally confirmed it. After all, this governor had always been her trusted aide. She had raised him single-handedly and was loyal to her. Qin Heng and Qin Ye's deaths also made the eldest princess's heart palpitate. She had not thought that the situation in Jingdo would develop like this. Fan Xian's last sentence revealed all the answers and finally made her angry. After only being angry for a moment, the eldest princess had already calmed down. She opened her eyes. Her lips exhaled like orchids, but there was a faint sorrow. "Yet you still came to beg me. Since I have come, you can guess what has happened in Jingdo." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and sat naturally by the eldest princess's side. He and the eldest princess knew each other well. The reason he dared to enter the courtyard alone and the eldest princess let him in was because they each held the other's life in their hands. Neither wanted to, at the first opportunity, cut off all possibilities. The eldest princess had captured Wan'er and De Bao, and Fan Xian had already obtained an irreversible advantage in Jingdo. Li Yunrui suddenly lowered her head. Her wide sleeves covered the broken string zither. Her light-colored clothing trembled slightly under the movement of her shoulders. She appeared very pitiful. "I have come to beg you," Fan Xian said sincerely. "Let it go." Hearing the words, "let it go," Li Yunrui suddenly raised her head and looked at Fan Xian with an indifferent gaze. She didn't say a word. Although her gaze was indifferent, Fan Xian saw a bone-deep resentment in it. However, this resentment was clearly not directed at him. Instead, it was directed at someone who had seen through him and was directed at someone who was not present. "Let it go? What right do you have to say these words to me?" Li Yunrui smiled slightly mockingly and picked up a faint flower petal from her shoulder. "For Yi Zhong to betray, this has indeed exceeded my expectations. However, since you have come, what do I have to worry about? Perhaps many people are afraid of your martial power, your brain, and the Overwatch Council. But, from the beginning only I have never worried about your existence." Fan Xian was silent. "Everyone thinks that under your glamorous appearance you are ruthless." The eldest princess looked at him with slight mockery. "It has to be said, your disguise in the Overwatch Council these years has been very good. You made people think that at a critical juncture of great interest, you could transform into a person who would not recognize family. But I know that you were never like that. So, you captured Wan'er and De Bao and did not let them go for even a moment." Fan Xian cut off her words. "2 years ago I said that you appear powerful, but in reality, you cannot withstand a single blow," Li Yunrui slowly said. "You care about too many people in this world. Your entire body is a lifeline. If I randomly grab one of them, you won't be able to turn things around. Otherwise, why would you not stay in Jingdo right now? Why would you sneak over to me?" Fan Xian lowered his head. A moment later he faintly said, "I have to admit, you are very good at reading people. I care about too many people. This makes it very inconvenient for me to do things." Using Wan'er as an example, You can use your own daughter's life to threaten your son-in-law, but I cannot. On the contrary, for Wan'er's life, I am willing to give up my life. I have suffered like this every night these 10 days. In the end, I still have to admit this." Hearing these words, a faint light rose to the eldest princess' slightly lowered eyelids. Fan Xian gazed calmly at the smooth surface of the lake and the slowly flowing flower petals. Calmly he said, "But, being willing to give up my life and being threatened by someone are two different concepts. If Wan'er is sick and needs my head to treat her illness, perhaps I will also cut it off. But if my death is of no benefit to Wan'er's safety, why would I do such a thing?" He turned his head to look at her and said, "I came today to ask you to understand that it is useless to threaten me. Of course we can talk about how this matter can end well. I care about many people. My entire body is a lifeline." Before the eldest princess opened her mouth, Fan Xian blocked the last opening. "But, because there are many lifelines, it is no longer a lifeline. I can't turn around and attack again for Wan'er. If that happened, what would happen to my father? What would happen to the eldest and third brothers? They are all family. Naturally, it is impossible to distinguish the importance. Presumably Wan'er would agree with my view and actions." The eldest princess couldn't help but smile slightly and shake her head. Fan Xian's words had already blocked off all avenues of her threat. Although she could still try, her thoughts had long floated elsewhere. Faintly she sighed and said, "The eldest and third brothers, it looks like you have finally admitted your identity. The men of the Li family are always so hypocritical and shameless. What good is there in saying so much? It's nothing more than forcing me to make things difficult. Then you can comfort yourself that the deaths of Wan'er and that idiot have nothing to do with you. You were just forced to do it. Because of family and righteousness, you could only watch without lifting a finger. The one without conscience is me. After the matter is sad, the one comforted by thousands is you." She gazed at Fan Xian's face and smiled slightly. "Don't you think you are very shameless?" She paused and then said self-mockingly, "In this aspect you are very similar to your father." The father she was talking about was, naturally, the emperor. Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "To have the intention to do evil and hide it is shameless. I was forced by you until I had no choice. In the depths of my heart, I don't want anything to happen to Wan'er." The two people's negotiations had reached an impasse. At this moment, Fan Xian could kill the eldest princess at will. However, there was still no trace of Wan'er and De Bao. They were probably being watched by Xinjiang aces in some corner. If Fan Xian acted, the first to die would probably be Wan'er. Fan Xian's expression was calm, but he began to worry in the depths of his heart. Faced with such a despairing young woman, he was unable to give her anything she wanted. What should he do next? The eldest princess's expression became serious. It was the complete opposite of her beautiful appearance and peaceful makeup. She gazed dazedly at the surface of the lake and said, "I said earlier that the men of the Li family are shameless. It was not wrong. The emperor did not kill me in Guangxin Palace last time because he gave me a chance. On one hand, it was in accordance with his wishes. On the other hand, he could kill me justifiably and not have to worry about how this journey would be described in the history books." She looked at Fan Xian and calmly said, "He has never truly cared for me as a sister. Since he confidently gave me this chance, I will certainly give him a great surprise." In Fan Xian's opinion, the emperor's trip to Dong Mountain to worship heaven had indeed taken a great risk. Furthermore, he had completely underestimated the eldest princess's methods. To be able to invite two great grandmasters from a foreign country to move the rebel army to surround the capital, such powerful persuasive and organizational skills, and such a large plan were truly difficult to imagine that such a weak woman could shoulder it alone. However, Yi Zhong's strike also made Fan Xian understand one thing. The eldest princess had laid out a large plan, but the emperor had laid out an even larger plan. The only people who could completely destroy the eldest princess were her brother or that strange old cripple in this matter. "And Ji, I want to ask you a question," the eldest princess suddenly said. "In the past, I have also tried to repair our relationship, but why have you always pulled your hands behind your back?" Before Fan Xian could reply, Li Yunrui spoke first and lightly, "Don't say it's because I once tried to kill you or because some of your trusted aides died at my hands. You and I both know what kind of person you are. Perhaps you are loyal to your family and friends, but it doesn't mean you are a hot-blooded man." Fan Xian was silent. A moment later he said, "So, it's very simple. You won't retreat and the emperor will not accept us becoming close." In reality, he didn't want to talk about the past with the eldest princess. However, the eldest princess had strangled his lifeline, so he could only feign civility. However, The eldest princess did not seem to be looking back at the past at a loss after her grand plan had failed. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He stared into the eldest princess's eyes. She lowered her head slightly and said, "Don't misunderstand. I have no desire to join hands with you again. Regardless of whether Brother Emperor lives or dies, I don't have much interest in this world." Fan Xian suddenly realized that her expression was very bleak. Brother is indeed still the most powerful person in the world. Li Yunrui suddenly smiled slightly. I made a big mistake. I thought he only wanted to use the Dong Mountain heaven worship to draw out Uncle Lu Yun to kill him. I didn't expect him to have such a powerful ambition. It looks like these dozen years of keeping a low profile and enduring has made it difficult for him to endure the loneliness. Fan Xian's entry into the garden brought her endless grievous news. Given the eldest princess's genius at scheming, she guessed the truth of Dong Mountain in the shortest amount of time. She guessed the emperor's intentions and understood why she hadn't received any news from Dong Mountain Road in 5 days. Don't think that just because news from Dong Mountain Road has been sealed, it means that Brother Emperor is still alive. The eldest princess closed her eyes slightly and faintly said, "That old cripple can also do this. I'm afraid the situation on Dong Mountain is not what you hope for. Since Yi Zhong has taken action, Great Grandmaster Lu Yun will also take action," Fan Xian said with his head lowered. An expression of seeing through everything rose to the eldest princess's face. Lightly she said, "Although Sigu Jian and Ku He believe Yi Lu Yun is one of my people, how could those two strange creatures so easily believe a person of Qin Kingdom?" Li Yunrui's eyes narrowed, but there was no sense of cold killing intent. There was only indifference and indifference. "You and Brother Emperor seem to have both thought of one thing wrong. After all, I am a person of Qin Kingdom. My entire life has been spent on how to help Brother unify the world. How could I not take into account the dangers that the Qin Kingdom would face in the future when I was about to leave? I have never underestimated Brother. I believe that even in desperate straits, he would still have a miraculous hand to turn the tables. I just didn't think that his miraculous hand would be Uncle Lu Yun. But, from the beginning, I had never thought of letting Ku He and Sigu Jian return alive. The 4 great grandmasters will be at Dong Mountain. Even if Uncle Lu Yun takes action, it will only be a 2-on-2 situation. What kind of people are Ku He and Sigu Jian? If Brother Emperor wants to kill the 2 great grandmasters just like this, his thinking is a bit too simple. I trust Brother, so I believe that even if he dies he will drag the 2 great grandmasters down with him. Otherwise, how could they be worthy of his intelligence and power?" The eldest princess said indifferently. "At that time, even if the Qin Kingdom has Uncle Lu Yun, Northern Qi and Dongyi will have no one to support them. What is so strange about the current development of the situation? If Uncle Lu Yun takes action and the 4 great grandmasters are completely destroyed, it is no different from what I think. Strange creatures like great grandmasters should not exist in this world. If there were no great grandmasters, given the military power of the Qin Kingdom, we would have long unified the world. Why would we wait until today? No matter what happens on Dong Mountain, it will be of great benefit to the Qin Kingdom. The 4 great grandmasters will go to Dong Mountain. Once they all die, with that kind of momentum, do you think the emperor will be lucky enough to survive?" Without allowing Fan Xian to speak, the eldest princess coldly threw out each sentence, making Fan Xian's lips go dry. He didn't know how to respond. He had not thought that from the beginning, the eldest princess had never thought about the great grandmasters on Dong Mountain being able to survive. However, she was not an immortal and couldn't calculate all the details. However, the development of the situation did not seem to be too far from what she had expected. The only variable had appeared in Jingdo. He had left Dong Mountain alive in Yi Zhong's strike. If the 4 old men die with Brother Emperor, do you think I care? Do you think I care who sits on the throne? Even if you control Jingdo and Qingqian's inability to ascend makes me disappointed, what do these small setbacks count for? The eldest princess glanced at Fan Xian and mockingly said, "Of the emperor's 5 sons, other than the 3rd prince who is still young, the other 4, even the most useless 2nd prince, can lead the Qin Kingdom to conquer the world. Use the 4 great grandmasters to accompany the emperor in death." A proud and crazy glow rose to the eldest princess's face. Presumably, he will be satisfied with having 4 guards like this in the netherworld. If I then gift his son a great world, I can say I have not let him down. What about you? Fan Xian asked in a raspy voice. Only now did he truly understand why his father and Qin Pingping kept saying by his ear that this woman was crazy. Indeed, after creating such a big mess, she didn't care at all who could survive to the end in the battle in Jingdo or sit on the throne. In any case, they were all children of the Li family and the emperor's sons. Meh. The eldest princess looked at her son-in-law like she was looking at an idiot and faintly said, "The rough soil on the ground or the dazzling shooting star in the world, which one do you want to be? In life, one only needs to release the light that belongs to oneself. Human words are not to be feared, and history books are not to be feared. Someone like Brother Emperor who likes face will, in the end, need my help." Although he knew that he had single-handedly caused the eldest princess and the emperor's final break, Fan Xian still couldn't resist asking in a raspy voice, "But why did you do this?" The question was vague, but the eldest princess heard it clearly. Glancing at the quiet and simple scenery of Taiping Courtyard, she slowly said, "Because he betrayed me. Because I wanted to prove to everyone that a woman can also change the many years of history that these stinky men have dominated." She slowly stood. Flower petals slid down from her body. She looked very beautiful. Fan Xian listened to these words in a daze, particularly the last sentence. He had heard it in Guangxin Palace. It appeared to be ear-piercing and shocking. Li Yunrui used a greedy gaze to glance at the scenery of Taiping Courtyard. In a low voice she said reluctantly, "When I was little, I liked this courtyard, but brother always wouldn't let me come. Later when I asked father for it, I was scolded by brother. At that time, the mistress of this courtyard was very tyrannical." She smiled slightly and spun her body, causing the nearby trees to tremble slightly. A dozen more flower petals fell. She looked at Fan Xian and said in a soft and charming voice, "Tell me, do you think I've finally won against your mother?" Fan Xian had long sunk into a strange emotion. Suddenly hearing these words, he didn't know how to respond. He could only smile bitterly again and again. The eldest princess stepped on her bare feet and slowly danced on the green grass. She carried a gentle, relaxed, and joyful emotion. Looking at this scene for some reason, Fan Xian felt an incomparable anger in his heart. Yes, you all stood higher than everyone else and saw further than everyone else. Regardless of whether it was the emperor or Li Yunrui, their gazes were never on Jingdo from the beginning. Instead, they were fixed on Dong Mountain and the four great grandmasters who should not have existed in this world. How many people died? How many families were destroyed in Jingdo? How many soldiers of the Qing kingdom have lost their heads and lost their lives because they wanted to leave their names in the annals of history? How many people cried bitterly and grieved? "You are not as good as her," Fan Xian suddenly said. The eldest princess's bare feet suddenly stopped on the grass. She turned her head and looked at Fan Xian with a cold gaze. It was as if she was waiting for him to give an explanation. Fan Xian raised his brows and continued to sit on the ground. With slight mockery he said, "When my mother came into this world, she could at least make the Qing people laugh. You can only make the people of the world cry." Li Yunrui smiled faintly and revealed a mocking expression. She was not moved at all. However, Fan Xian's following words made her angry. Fan Xian shook his head and said in a matter-of-fact tone, "I've seen my mother's portrait. I have to say, she was prettier than you." Fan Xian smiled. "Everyone loves Yi Qingmei, isn't that so?" He stood up and patted the grass off his butt, not looking at Li Yunrui's expression. Since he knew that the eldest princess had the will to die at the beginning of her plan and only hoped for the last bit of glory in the world before going to the underworld to find her lover, Fan Xian was tired. He only wanted to provoke her, create a variable and find a way to save Wan and De Bao. Of course, there was still a gargantuan doubt circling around his heart. Would the emperor be able to survive in the turbulence of the Grandmaster's battle? Chapter 575. If time was a clock that could be accurately calculated and could be controlled at will, then let us follow the clock in the scene of passing through time and start moving in the opposite direction, returning to the time of the Great Dong Mountain. Let us see the drenched yellow robe, the burning sword, the middle-aged man the tip of the sword pointed at, and countless people in the rain. Then the second hand gently struggled, bounced and passed the first grid. Following Sigu Jian's finger, the long sword that had been floating in the air suddenly flew out. Circling around his body in a semicircle, it pierced straight toward the Qing Emperor's back. Yi Luyun had already come to the Qing Emperor's side and stretched out his pure white hands that were like metal and stone. The sword had already pierced through the air and tore through the thick yuanqi that might or might not have existed on Dong Mountain. In the next second, it seemed like it was going to pierce into the Emperor's back. However, that pair of pure white and even somewhat childish hands exceeded everyone's expectations as they gently pressed towards the sword. The situation of the great grandmasters surrounding and killing the Qing Emperor on Dong Mountain finally underwent a shocking change. Yi Luyun attacked the sword and not the Emperor. The first thing that came into contact with this killing sword was Yi Liuyun's sleeve. The wide sleeves were woven from linen. In that instant they became extremely soft. They were like the clouds that often floated on the mountainside of Dong Mountain when there was no rain. They softly wrapped around the rapidly flying sword in layers. The strands of clouds snapped, and the hemp sleeves shattered into butterflies that danced on the summit of Dong Mountain. The sword, on the other hand, had expended its essence in such a gentle entanglement. The coldness and killing intent it carried suddenly disappeared. It became a piece of scrap metal, dim, lightless, and very petty. The power of this sword was too vicious and severe. After Yi Luyun recited a verse, he had no choice but to come out and protect the emperor's safety. However, when he revealed his true position, he was unable to find the most critical point to carry out an ambush. How should he deal with the following situation? Yi Luyun's white beard was soaked by the rain, but his eyes looked seriously at the sword in his hand. He did not feel any contempt because of the sword's dimness. He also did not feel any unease because he had been forced to attack early and was unable to kill Sigu Jian. He just looked at the sword seriously and held it in his hand. It was as if this ordinary sword contained countless ghosts and gods that would come out at any moment and devour everyone on the mountaintop. His hands, which were as steady as jade, formed an illusory circle. The mouth of his thumb and index finger turned into a circle. The silent and lightless heavenly sword abruptly stood motionless in midair. He was a great grandmaster, so he knew that all of Sigu Jian's sword intent was contained in this sword. If he still did not act, the body of the sword would completely pierce into the emperor's body. He had wandered the 4 seas for many years for this moment. However, he had been forced to act early. Sigu Jian was not truly an idiot. Just as the eldest princess had expected, although he had not expected Yi Luyun to stand on the Qing emperor's side, these 2 great grandmasters of northern Qi and Dongyi had the deepest understanding of the Qing people's sinister and cunning. Until the last moment they would not allow themselves to sink into danger. The short body wearing the straw hat actually contained the wisdom of a great grandmaster that was completely different from his reputation in history. He only used the sword outside his body to break the Qing emperor's plan and force out the true killer on Dong Mountain, Yi Luyun. Just as Yi Luyun stood in front of the Qing emperor like a bright sun with his hands in a circle, forcefully suppressing the sharp sword, Sigu Jian's body began to tremble. The hemp clothing on his body shook violently like it had been struck by lightning. His sword had already flown into the air and stopped between Yi Luyun's steady hands. Following the shaking of his body, a startling sword intent pierced through the hemp clothing he wore and shot into the sky. Summoned by this sword intent, the sword Yi Luyun's bare hands controlled also began to tremble violently. It buzzed in the air and shone with light again. The rain continued to pour down on Dong Mountain. In such a short period of time, the raindrops seemed to be moving at a strangely slow speed, delicately sensing the attractive force of the earth. They no longer fell in a torrential downpour. Instead, they were like sparkling and translucent pearls. Behind the heavy curtain of pearls and jade, the short man in hemp clothing used his body as a sword. His momentum broke through the heavens and the earth. Just like that, he traversed more than 100 feet and arrived in front of Yi Luyun like a bolt of lightning. He stretched out his hand and pressed down on the ordinary sword that he had worn by his side for decades. Sigu Jian's hand once again gripped his sword. The tip of the sword spat out wildly like a silver snake dancing chaotically with an imposing aura. Just as the still curtain of rain was forcefully broken through by the hemp-clothed Sigu Jian, Yi Luyun's eyes abruptly shone with a bright light. Like a flowing cloud enveloping the sun, he forcefully absorbed the sun's energy. With a muffled grunt, his 2 palms, which had formed a circle, came together inwards. With a crisp clap, the empty air was like solid metal. A moment later, it was forcefully crushed by this pair of pure white hands and merged with the body of the sword. For a great grandmaster there were no traps. Even though the Qing emperor had set up a trap and hidden Yi Luyun until the end, Sigu Jian had still easily pierced through the layers of fog with one strike. Immediately after, Sigu Jian used this great opportunity to pour all of his sword power back into the sword. To Yi Luyun's side was the Qing emperor. Faced with this swift and fierce strike, he could not dodge it. He could only use the cloud hand to forcefully block it. However, when the endless sword power was matched against the physical body, Yi Luyun could not use his Sanzhou techniques to his heart's content. Sigu Jian had seized this opportunity. In a battle between great grandmasters, the occasional thought could change the color of heaven and earth. It only needed a slight shift for the situation to shift. Sigu Jian cried out shrilly and crazily. All of the ruthless sword chi in his body surged into the sword in his hand. The speed at which the sword chi surged was so fast that the hilt of the sword in his hand suddenly became hot. With a whoosh, it evaporated all of the water on the grass rope. The terrifying sound of metal scraping against stone rang out. The long sword between Yi Liuyun's tightly clasped hands advanced an inch. Yi Liuyun's head remained slightly lowered. The wide sleeves on his arms had long become butterflies dancing in the air around him. The most stable pair of arms in the world held the sword tightly between them. A moment later, the skin on his hands began to crack inch by inch. It was like a patient who had contracted some kind of skin disease. The skin aged and the edges curled up. It looked like the land during the drought in the 5th year of the Qing calendar, cracking open. It was strangely terrifying and miraculous. His eyes were filled with a calm gaze as he watched the sword in his hands inch closer to his body. He did not reveal a glimmer of emotion. He only spat out one word. Cloud. Following this word, the two arms, whose skin had already cracked open by the supreme sword chi, abruptly became soft. They were deeper than the ocean, softer than lake water, and purer than the eyes of a Jiangnan woman. They were the clouds in the sky. Strands of the clouds were like longing. Strand by strand they were tied to the startling sword. It made the extremely powerful sword suddenly meet with gentleness and had no choice but to temporarily stop along the way. In this short second, the heavens, in good humor, bestowed a bolt of lightning that lit up the particularly dark mountaintop covered by dark clouds. The lightning lit up Sigu Jian's face under his bamboo hat. His eyes were filled with a wild aura like that of a wild beast. He didn't say a single word. He only howled shrilly. The howl echoed through Dong Mountain and knocked countless people unconscious. He was a great grandmaster who used the sword. He used the Sigu sword. He focused on what was in front and disregarded what was behind, pressing forward with an indomitable will. The power of the sword surged out along with the howl. The rising ruthlessness could not be stopped. Boundless murderous intent and ruthless aura were all in this strike. This was the most powerful strike Sigu Jian had made since he was born. It was a strike formed from his entire life, spirit, and belief. The power of the sword was swift and ruthless. It already had traces of being heaven-defying. On this land, no one had ever made such a strike before. There probably wouldn't be one in the future. No one could stop it. Not even Yi Luyun. In a situation, it was often difficult to distinguish between the people in the situation and the people outside the situation. The people who planned to win often only realized in the moment things ended that no matter how they had schemed against themselves and ruined their lives. The development of things would always drift further and further away from the original plans of those in control. If he had known everything that had happened in this second when the clock stopped, perhaps the Qing Emperor would have chosen to gather the Tiger Guards on the mountain at the very beginning and have the Qing Kingdom's two great grandmasters face off against Ku He and Sigu Jian. With Wu Zhu at the side, he could have swung his knife after the 100 Tiger Guards were mutually wounded. How could the situation now have occurred? In the most important day of Sigu Jian's life, he perfectly demonstrated the wisdom and decisiveness of a great grandmaster. He only used one strike to force Yi Luyun out. He also perfectly used the Qing Emperor's plan and the Qing Emperor's life to force Yi Luyun into a hopeless situation. If Sigu Jian had not used up some of his energy when he was climbing the stairs to heaven on Dong Mountain to kill the 100 Tiger Guards with one strike, perhaps that startling strike would have long pierced into Yi Luyun's abdomen. Of course, if he had not used the fresh blood of 100 Qing aces as a sacrifice to this sword to accumulate boundless bloody killing intent, perhaps Sigu Jian would not have been able to use such a heartless and ruthless strike. Yi Luyun had 3 ways to deal with this strike. Just like the last of the 36 stratagems in that world, when the situation had developed to an extreme, the best method was often the simplest method. Given this Qing great grandmaster's peerless movements and Luyun Sanzhou, when faced with Sigu Jian's startling strike, he could have chosen to retreat and escape. He could have used the Sanzhou Sea of Clouds to temporarily seal the edge of the sword for a moment. He only needed a moment to leave the area enveloped by the sword power. However, the Emperor was by his side. If he dodged, the Emperor would probably be turned into a sky full of minced meat under this heavenly sword. Thus Yi Luyun did not dodge. At this moment he was already unable to dodge. Wu Zhu, who had been standing silently at the door of the old temple, lowered his head. At some point, his hand had once again landed on the handle of the metal drill by his waist. The Emperor's life was on the line, but he still did not act. In the last-minute moment of this second, a slight smile suddenly flashed across Yi Luyun's crude face. It appeared particularly strange for this smile to appear at such a moment. A portion of the cloud-like hands was suddenly blown away by the wind on the summit of the mountain. It swept up and headed straight for Sigu Jian's face. Before the cloud arrived, the straw hat had already flown far away. The strong wind hit his face and blew directly at Sigu Jian's face. Since he could not block the strike, then why should he? Yi Luyun chose to remove one hand and spread out a patch of cloud to cover Sigu Jian's face. This was what low-level martial artists were best at, besieging the enemy to rescue the besieged. However, in the hands of this great grandmaster, it appeared free and at ease, leaving as he wished. It was a patch of cloud on the horizon. Following the ruthless and soaring sword intent, it gently and quickly floated toward Sigu Jian's face. If Sigu Jian ignored this Sanzhou and the long sword pierced into Yi Luyun's abdomen, with the sword intent and murderous aura contained in the sword, it could instantly shred Yi Luyun's organs to pieces. Even if Yi Luyun luckily survived, he would no longer have any ability to fight. If he wanted to avoid this Sanzhou with just a thought, a gap would naturally appear in the spirit that poured into the sword. How could an imperfect and ruthless swordsmanship stab a great grandmaster under the sword? Yi Luyun's choice at this moment was very wise. It could even be said to be wonderful. He knew that his cloud could not heavily injure Sigu Jian, but he forced Sigu Jian to make a choice in such a short amount of time. He used his life to gamble on Sigu Jian's heavy injury. He could clearly sense that Sigu Jian had already advanced into a realm of absolute killing. However, there was still Wu Zhu, Eunuch Yao and everyone else at the summit. Yi Luyun could die, but Sigu Jian could not be heavily injured. A heavily injured Sigu Jian could not guarantee that he could kill the Qing Emperor. Such an outcome was something Sigu Jian could not accept. Thus, his cloud flew out and waited for Sigu Jian to change his sword. But Sigu Jian did not change his sword. A wild aura continued to shine through his eyes. His black hair danced wildly in the mountain wind. He looked like a demon holding a sword. His aura was intimidating. The long sword continued to press toward Yi Luyun with an indomitable will. His left hand, however, was empty, pointing diagonally to the left. He didn't pay any attention to the cloud that was rushing towards him at all. There were tens of thousands of sword techniques in the world, but there was only one way to hold a sword. Sigu Jian's left hand was in the most standard way to hold a sword. The space between his thumb and forefingers was empty. Suddenly, a weak sword intent seeped out from the emptiness. Although it was weak, it was unusually easy to kill the bright yellow figure that the empty sword in his left hand pointed toward. Yi Luyun attacked Sigu Jian and had no choice but to save him. Sigu Jian held the hilt of his sword and used sword intent to break through the air to counterattack Yi Luyun. Chapter 576. On Dong Mountain. In order to ensure the harmony and ruthlessness of this strike, Sigu Jian had poured all of his energy into it. If he had to deal with the flowing cloud Yi Luyun sent out, he would have to pull back his sword. If he didn't, he could only attack the enemy's weakness. However, he could only split out a sliver of his attention. Of the 5 people present, the only person he could kill with just a sliver of his attention was the Qin Kingdom's emperor, who had an empty aura. It had to be said that from the beginning of Sigu Jian's attack in terms of aura and intelligence, he had suppressed Yi Luyun. At this moment he gave Yi Luyun a difficult problem and a surprise. What made Sigu Jian surprised, angry, uneasy, and at a loss was that Yi Luyun did not pay any attention to the empty sword Sigu Jian held. That ball of flowing cloud continued to move toward his face. The empty sword in his hand, after emitting a faint chi sound, pierced through the wet stone slabs of the mountain peak and fell into the air. The bright yellow and dim eyes on the dragon robe suddenly and strangely disappeared from the front of the empty sword. On the summit of Dong Mountain, 4 great grandmasters and an emperor. Everything seemed to take a long time. In reality, it only happened in a second. In this second, Sigu Jian used the sword in his hand to pick up Yi Luyun's cloud and used the empty sword to stab toward the Qing Emperor. On the other side of this second, an even more hair-raising story happened. This story happened at the beginning of this second. When Sigu Jian's sword flew to within a foot of the Qing Emperor's back, the Emperor had already sighed darkly and released the old hand that had been holding Eunuch Hong the entire time. It was as if he did not want this old man to be unable to enjoy the last battle of his life. At this moment, the Northern Qi Imperial Advisor Ku He's hand was perseveringly brushing against old Eunuch Hong's chest. This brush and press, with his thumb and index fingers slightly apart, was like a cool breeze brushing against a mountain. It was gentle and natural. It was completely different from the storm and lightning around them. However, when the wind brushed past, the mountain was thrown into chaos for no reason. Old Eunuch Hong gazed calmly at Ku He's face. His hands were like a pair of dragon whips, twisting and changing shape as they climbed onto Ku He's right arm. However, they did not stop his brush. With a muffled thud, old eunuch Hong's chest completely shattered. Under Ku He's natural and refreshing brush that contained the might of heaven and earth, his sternum was like a fragile piece of tofu. They all collapsed and caved in. Blood gushed out of old eunuch Hong's nose, and mouth. His life force was rapidly drained away as his sternum caved in, his blood gushed out wildly, and his vital energy flowed out. However, there was a hint of a faint smile, mockery, and killing intent in his aged eyes. An abyss-like feeling of emptiness came from his palm. Master Ku He's pupils suddenly constricted. This was the oldest great-grandmaster present, the uncle of the founding emperor of Northern Qi, and the once brilliant ascetic monk of the Wei Kingdom. No one knew how many things had happened in his life. He had gone to the temple to seek the way and discussed martial arts with the world. His temperament was steady and natural. No one could compare to him. Today the 4 great grandmasters were gathered at Dong Mountain. He had to pick up his sense of gain and loss again. He had to pull the heart of victory and defeat back into his hands. The tyrannical Jinqi emanating from the body of this old eunuch, who had hidden himself in the Qin kingdom for many years, was like the dry wind in the surroundings. The realm hidden within was, without question, that he was already a proper grandmaster. Thus Master Ku He did not hold back. He did not dare to hold back. This second brush of leaning against the mountains and rivers already contained the bottomless heavens path Jinqi in his body. In a battle between great grandmasters, some shocking changes could happen at any time. Thus, when Ku He's brush landed on old eunuch Hong's chest, he did not feel a glimmer of joy. The first brush had already been forcefully bounced back by the tyrannical Jinqi in old eunuch Hong's body. Although this kind of qi circulation method was overly tyrannical and could not be maintained for long, Ku He thought that old eunuch Hong would certainly have a way to deal with his second brush. However, old eunuch Hong did not manage to block this brush. His chest shattered. The tyrannical aura on the old eunuch's body disappeared without a trace in an instant. No one knew where it had gone. Even if old eunuch Hong's chest suddenly became a metal plate and grew a second head, perhaps Ku He would not be surprised. Yet this scene made Ku He feel incredulous. Where did the abundant and irresistible tyrannical Jinqi go? In the end, a great grandmaster was a person and not a god. Even with his and Sigu Jian's miraculous cultivation, it was impossible for them to abruptly disperse the aura that had already reached the peak of the human world in such a short time. It was like a ball filled with energy. How could it completely dissipate in an instant? The transfer of any kind of energy always required time. The shorter the time, the more terrifying the shaking during this process. Regardless of whether it was Ku He, Sigu Jian, or Yi Luyun, if they were like old eunuch Hong and completely released all of the Jinqi in their bodies in such a short time, they could not avoid the fate of their bodies falling apart and dying in the next moment. Why could old eunuch Hong do this? Why did he dare to do this? Ku He's pupils constricted. A raindrop stopped half an inch in front of his eyelids, reflecting a faint black light. He unconsciously sensed an unfamiliar sense of danger, the sense of death. In his long journey of life, the last time Master Ku He had sunk into such a state of mind was when he reunited with the blind man in the 5th year of the Qin calendar. However, the danger he sensed then was not as great as now. When these thoughts swept through Master Ku He's mind like a sky full of raindrops, his gentle right hand had already shattered Hong Xiang's sternum. Like a hot knife through butter, it broke through the thin and old body and extended out from his back. His heart, which had been shattered into 5 pieces, sprayed out arrows of blood in a frightening manner under the still curtain of raindrops. Hong Xiang was already dead. No one could survive after their heart had been shattered. His body was bent. He no longer had the godlike domineering appearance that Sigu Jian had when he ascended the mountain. Instead, he was like a pitiful dwarf, covered in blood, hanging from Ku He's right hand. Hong Xiang was not dead. Although his heart had been shattered and his breath was gone, the meridians in his body still maintained the state they were in before he died. All of his Jinqi was desperately being released toward heaven and earth. From the end of his meridians, it scattered into the surrounding nature. It was like a black hole. Although it was deathly still, it relied on some miraculous law and used his body and meridians as a bridge to send out, absorb, and dim, including the arm in his body. Master Ku He had used all of his strength in this brush. The abundant Jinqi in his body seeped out from every pore and inch of skin. Following Hong Xiang's reversal of the secret method that used his life as the price, it endlessly leaked outwards. Ku He's eyes lit up. It was not an understanding. It was a feeling. The raindrop less than an inch in front of his eyes was still floating in the air. He already understood that he had fallen into a trap. Dong Mountain itself was a trap. Hong Xiang was not a great grandmaster. The domineering aura he had released earlier at the top of the mountain was borrowed. His realm was also borrowed. It was because it was not his own that he was able to release it with all his strength at the expense of his body and spirit. That was why it appeared particularly ruthless and did not seem to be at the level a human should have. Hong Xiang had long prepared to die. Someone wanted to use his death to absorb a bit of his jinqi. His final brush, which relied on the mountain and water, had already sent out his jinqi. A gap had already appeared in the protection of his body and life. That person wanted to use this gap. That person had displayed the incomparably wondrous realm through Hong Xiang. Having no time to sense the changes between the sword fanatic and Lu Yun, Master Ku He's eyes grew brighter. Like an autumn moon, it appeared without warning in a pool of green water. His favorite female disciple, Haitang, had the cleanest and brightest eyes in the world. If compared to Ku He's eyes, it was like comparing a firefly to a bright moon. Ku He was the person with the most meticulous perception of his surroundings in the world. His personality was the most gentle but also the strongest. This could be seen from his trip to the temple many years ago. When he discovered that old eunuch Hong was a trap, his reaction followed. There was no one else in the world who could change so quickly. Perhaps it was only 1/100th of a second. He should have reacted a bit faster than the person who set the trap had imagined. But it was very likely a fatal time difference. Ku He's eyes were as bright as the moon and as pure as the lone star. He took a deep breath. With this breath, it was as if he wanted to suck in all of the air on the peak of Dong Mountain. The old man's chest suddenly swelled up. His entire body seemed to have grown 2 inches. Following this breath, the supreme jinqi of Tianyi Dao in his body also began to breathe from his right arm. It followed the natural inhalation and exhalation of the world and easily broke free from the pull of the aura emanating from Hong Xiang's body. It began to use the fastest speed to circulate through his meridians. Only Tianyi Dao's peaceful method could display such a fast change so naturally. There was no difference between time and stillness. There was no time to make any movement controlled by muscles. However, the jinqi that flowed through a person's body like mercury and light could faintly break through the limits of time and complete its mission. The jinqi flowed back. Eunuch Hong's thin and weak body turned into a mist of blood that filled the sky but did not have time to dissipate. No one noticed that Ku He's left hand, which hung by his side, naturally curled up a finger and drew a semicircle in the air, making a hand gesture that had never appeared on this land. Following this hand gesture, the rain that filled the sky once again paused. The faint aura that was mixed in the wind and rain on the peak of Dong Mountain and soaked in the ruins of the ancient temple poured into his body at an astonishing speed. The aura summoned by the strange hand gesture was very weak. In such a dangerous moment, a stick of firewood or a drop of water were all precious existences in a battle between grandmasters. What exactly was this hand gesture? It could actually suck in jinqi from the empty air and the eaves of the temple? Magic. The magic that the sorcerers practiced on the other side of the ocean. Yet it had appeared in Master Ku He's hands. On the rain-drenched Dong Mountain, the Northern Qi Imperial Advisor Ku He finally used his greatest trump card. He used a method that was usually of no help, but at this moment, could help him speed up the recovery of his jinqi. When he fought against Wu Zhu, he had not used this magical treasure. But now he used it without hesitation. In the instant that old eunuch Hong died, before the mist of blood had time to disperse, a hand as white as jade, stretched out from the mist of blood. This scene appeared strangely strange. A hand as steady as white jade stretched out from the bloody mist. It was like a divine hand reaching out from the depths of hell to plunder all life in the world. In the instant he sensed this hand, the light in Ku He's eyes grew brighter and brighter. His first reaction was normal. This hand should be Yi Liuyun's. Only Yi Liuyun's hand could be so steady and wondrous. However, Ku He was not afraid. The Tianyi Dao jinqi in his body had long returned to his body. The faint yuanqi of heaven and earth summoned by a miraculous spell had also seeped into his meridians through his 36,000 pores. The jinqi in his body had already reached its peak. With each tremble, it had reached the limit that a human could contain. If Ku He wanted to use old eunuch Hong's death to create an opening in his power, then Ku He's strangely fast reaction and the magic hand gesture that no one had expected perfectly filled in this opening. In fact, it was a bit too perfect. That spotlessly white hand suddenly hid the radiance on its skin, but it appeared even more terrifying. Even in such a high-speed realm, it didn't tremble in the slightest. With an unbelievable level of stability and power, it passed through that bloody mist with incredible speed and pressed down. As it moved, the hand loosened 4 fingers. The index finger curled up slightly. The soft and firm fingertip broke the drop of rain an inch in front of Master Kuhi's eyes. It then gently landed between his brows. It was as if it was going to mark a bright red mole between his brows. The drop of rain was broken by the finger and turned into a small hollow water circle. Beautiful ripples floated around it as it slowly expanded. However, a red mole did not appear between Kuhi's brows. On the contrary, it grew brighter. It was as if all the light in Kuhi's dimming eyes had been sent to the space between his brows. Master Kuhi used the supreme Jinchi of Tianyi Dao he had cultivated for decades and the Yuanqi of heaven and earth he had summoned through a spell to gather between his brows and forcefully resist this beautiful finger. The slightly curled and steady index finger did not forcefully resist the pure Jinchi between his brows. Instead, it used a slow and gentle method to pour in. There was no ruthlessness, no intent to kill, and no natural aura. There was only the most upright and proper rules of the world. The way of the king. The tip of the finger moved down again. With a whoosh, it swiftly pointed out and pierced directly into Kuhi's chest. Although it was just the movement of a finger, it faintly made one feel like there was the movement of a dragon or a tiger. One finger had the dignity of an emperor. Kuhi had already pulled back his right hand. With a serious expression, he raised his thumb. Miraculously, it met the index finger and made a muffled thud. The index finger moved down again, piercing straight into Kuhi's abdomen. Kuhi lowered his eyelids. His hemp clothing swayed slightly. His flat finger became a palm. His right palm was like a trickling stream flowing with the mountain. It naturally hung down and blocked the finger in front of his abdomen. All of this proceeded as if it should be. However, Kuhi's body began to tremble violently. A red spot appeared in the center of his right palm. It sizzled like a red-hot branding iron. The steady hand only stretched out 3 fingers. These 3 fingers were not meant to kill, to destroy, or to resist. Instead, they were meant to give. They were upright and straightforward, without the slightest hint of a sneak attack. The heart and bearing of a monarch were all contained within these 3 fingers, and the aura of the Tao of Kings was completely revealed. Another bolt of lightning rang out in the sky. Kuhi's body was like a kite with its string cut. Dispiritedly and powerlessly, he flew into the distance toward the large tree beside the stone path on Dong Mountain. He sat cross-legged and sighed. Kuhi knew he had been wrong. He had been wrong from the very beginning. The most fatal mistake had happened 3 fingers ago. After he realized that Hong Xiang was a trap, his reaction speed had been too fast. His method of response had been too sufficient. He had raised his realm too perfectly. At that moment, Kuhi was like a large tree that reached into the clouds and reached the highest point in the world. He was like a lake of autumn water that had already formed a vast and mighty force. That person had only extended 3 fingers and poured about half of the Jinchi in his body into Kuhi's body. With the power of the way of the king, a tyrannical aura was poured in. Master Kuhi, who had to endure all of this in such a short time, was like a large tree that reached into the clouds being pressed down by another giant tree. It was like the heavens had suddenly poured half a lake of autumn water into the full lake. When the water was full, it overflowed. The lake dam collapsed. The tree trunk also snapped in the middle with a crack. Compared to mortals, a great grandmaster's state of mind was close to that of a god. Kuhi was known as the person closest to a god in the world. In the end, great grandmasters had their own weaknesses. Their weakness was their physical bodies. The meridians in their bodies had a limit. There was also a limit to what the physical body could endure. The Jinchi that had been poured in by the 3 fingers had forcefully broken through Kuhi's limit. The meridians and physical body in his body had received irreparable damage. Sitting cross-legged under the tree, Kuhi felt the swelling sensation from his skin. There was still a glimmer of doubt in his heart. How could the owner of that hand be able to spit out so much Jinchi in such a short time? This was a speed that the meridians of the human body could not endure. Everything should have already ended. When Hong Xiang turned into a bloody mist, the empty sword in Sigu Jian's left hand stabbed out at a slanted angle. He stabbed empty air. He had no choice but to save Yi Luyun, but Yi Luyun did not save him at all. That ball of flowing cloud had already covered Sigu Jian's face. Sigu Jian trembled in anger and cried out wretchedly. Lowering his head, he twisted his right wrist. The sword pressed toward Yi Luyun's abdomen. The illusory sword in his left hand missed. Immediately after, he lowered his head. A weak spot finally appeared in the ruthless and harmonious sword. However, he had to dodge because he knew the situation had changed. He had to survive. Sigu Jian survived. Half of his face had been smashed to pieces by Yi Liuyun's Sanzhou. Yi Liyun also survived. He lowered his head coldly and tightened his left hand around the sword, only allowing it to enter an inch into his abdomen. It was not over. Yi Liuyun's Sanzhou had not ended its momentum. It cleaved down and struck Sigu Jian's shoulder with a thud. His 5 fingers were like a dragon's claw. They shot out from the cloud and sank deep into flesh and bone. It was as if Sigu Jian did not feel any pain. He pulled back his left hand and struck his wrist with it. The long sword entered another inch into Yi Liuyun's abdomen. Then the tip of the sword flashed with light. It was shattered by the powerful sword force and bloomed into a beautiful flower. This was a terrifying sword strike. Although it had encountered many unexpected problems along the way, it still relied on the ruthlessness it carried from the beginning to successfully heavily injure Yi Liyun. At this moment, the ball of bloody mist dissipated. A bright yellow figure appeared from behind the bloody mist. It seemed to hide the fact that every emperor had to use the blood of countless people to pave the foundation of his immortal empire. The bright yellow figure appeared between Yi Liyun and Sigu Jian and threw out a punch. There were no flashy moves or techniques involved. It was just a simple and clear strike. However, there was no one in the world who could throw out such a simple and clear punch. It was open and above board, yet it made it impossible for one to dodge. In fact, it was impossible to dodge. First, there was a tearing sound. His body received a powerful Jinqi attack. Sigu Jian's right arm, which had been grabbed by Yi Liuyun's dragon claw, broke apart. Immediately after, there was a muffled sound like that of an ancient temple's bell. A complicated expression flashed through Sigu Jian's eyes. Looking at the bright yellow figure in front of him, his entire body was sent flying. With that expression, Sigu Jian flew with his broken arm and smashed through the wooden door of Dongshanqing Temple. The powerful force smashed through countless structures in the ancient temple. Like a large boulder, he crushed everything his body came into contact with. In the end, he crashed into the large bell in the small ancestral hall in the depths of the ancient temple and made a ringing sound. On the opposite side of the ancient temple, under a large tree by the stone path, Ku He, dressed in hemp clothing, watched this scene with a perplexed expression. He sat cross-legged. It was as if he had been triggered by the sound of the bell. Something in his body suddenly exploded. Immediately after, it shrank. Fresh blood seeped out of his eyes and ears. The large tree behind Ku He collapsed with a rumble and shattered into pieces. The stones within a 5-foot radius around him were all squeezed into 3-dimensional surfaces by the Jinqi that exploded out of his body. They were either ferocious or sorrowful as they raised their sharp corners to welcome the last of the rain from the heavens. Most of the buildings in the old temple of Qing had become ruins. The ancient myths and legends painted in oil had become powdered memories of the past. The moss-covered pool was missing a large opening, and the rainwater inside flowed out, mixing with the soil and stones and becoming murky. A few white cranes, stunned by the commotion, cowered timidly behind the pool. A yellow cloth fell to the ground, covering Sigu Jian's body lying on the ground at the end of the wretched passageway. Only Sigu Jian's weak voice could be heard under the yellow cloth, wretchedly cursing something. However, his voice was already very weak. It was completely covered up by the sound of the bell above his head. The buzzing sound of the bell rang through the entire summit of Dong Mountain. The hurricane by the seaside came quickly and left quickly, just like the impermanence of the world and the happiness and anger of emperors. Earlier there had been a violent storm. Suddenly the wind and rain stopped. The dark clouds in the sky abruptly parted to reveal a gentle porcelain blue sky behind the clouds. A ray of light shone down clearly and landed on the bright yellow figure by the cliff of Dong Mountain, illuminating his face clearly. The Qing emperor stood where he was with a pale face. His 4 limbs were trembling. Half of the tyrannical Jinqi in his body had been poured into Ku He's body. The last fist of the way of the emperor had squeezed out the last of his spirit. He was extremely tired. The light of the sky was faint. The most powerful ruler in the world had his dragon robe drenched by the rain. His hair was also messy and hung weakly on his forehead. The calmness in his eyes contained countless emotions that could not be understood. In his life he had never been so wretched. In his life he had never been so powerful. I hope everyone is satisfied. I need everyone's monthly votes to encourage me. I've done my best. I'm satisfied. Today's chapter will be later because I have to do my best. This is like the archery championship earlier. As long as I do my best, I will win. Thank you. I'm very tired. Chapter 577. On the shore of the ocean, on Dong Mountain, the umpteenth hurricane in the 7th year of the Qing calendar stopped without a sound. In the following period of time, this hurricane would bring rare rainwater to the Qing kingdom, which was already showing signs of a slight drought. Furthermore, it was very gentle and did not cause too great a disaster. After the attack of the storm, the old eaves of the old temple on the mountaintop had become a pile of ruins. The ground was covered in rubble. Mud and stone flew everywhere. It was a tragic sight to behold. The rainwater first washed over it and then quickly flowed down the mountain, forming sections of pure white waterfalls on the jade-like precipices. Occasionally, there was a sliver of a faint blood-red color in the waterfalls. On the contrary, the mountaintop gradually became clean. There wasn't even a trace of the smell of blood left. Was such a scene created by the might of heaven or the Grandmaster's world-shaking battle? In reality, it was the might of heaven. The sky above the summit of Dong Mountain had gradually revealed its true appearance. The thick black clouds were blown away by the strong wind. At a speed visible to the naked eye, they quickly moved toward the sky inland in the west. A bright and clear light once again descended on the summit of the mountain and onto the body of the most powerful man in the world by the precipice. He was the most powerful person in the world, bar none. No one dared to call him by his name because he was the emperor of the most powerful Qing kingdom. He was a famous general who had led an army on 3 northern expeditions, forcefully breaking the Wei kingdom into pieces, and completely changing the shape of the world's territories. He was the schemer who used the emperor's schemes the most thoroughly, the most tolerant, and the most tenacious. Just these 3 identities were enough for him to be called the most powerful person in the world. Furthermore, at the end of the Dong Mountain killing situation, his last identity was revealed. The most mysterious of the 4 great grandmasters in the world, the strange creature rumored to have always guarded the Qing palace and not come out. Sigu Jian had entered Jingdo alone but had been forced back by the tyrannical power released by the royal palace, thus indirectly proving his existence. It was the emperor of the Qing kingdom. This was the emperor's final trump card. Fan Xian had once been puzzled. Just what kind of foundation was the emperor's powerful self-confidence and natural bearing built on? Many people were guessing at the emperor's trump card. In the last moment, Fan Xian guessed that it was the Yi family, but he would never have guessed that this flipped trump card had the word Grandmaster written on it. Hong Xixiang was just a cover, a flagpole sticking out from the back of the palace, gently swaying in the dark wind of the night, attracting the attention of all the wise men. Without a doubt, this old eunuch was one of the strongest in the world. Otherwise, he would not have been able to kill the Hu assassin in the floating temple with one palm. However, it was difficult for an abnormal person to reach the peak of the heavenly path. In order to kill Ku He and Sigu Jian in one fell swoop, the Qing emperor and eunuch Hong had worked painstakingly and cautiously for a full 20 years. Old eunuch Hong had already gloriously completed his mission of 20 years and turned into a bloody mist that filled the sky. Washed by the torrential rain and washed by the cool wind, it entered the white waterfall and fell into the East Sea. It entered the moist air of the forest and moistened the earth. His life essence, blood, and flesh all merged into the beautiful landscape of the Qing kingdom and could no longer be separated. Looking at the middle-aged man in the bright yellow dragon robe, the people present who had luckily survived all sank into a boundless shock. Everyone's throat seemed to be pinched by an invisible hand, unable to make a single sound. Without question, the truth that had unfolded on the peak of Dong Mountain was the most shocking and world-shaking news since the sudden death of Lady Yi 20 years ago. The ringing of the bell coming from the ruins of the ancient temple gradually grew weaker and calmed down. Beside the roots of the large tree that had already been shattered into countless pieces of bark, the Northern Qi imperial advisor Ku He, dressed in tattered hemp clothing, looked calmly at the Qing emperor at the edge of the cliff with a clear gaze in his eyes. The ruthless and tyrannical Zhenqi in his body finally calmed down as the ringing of the bell stopped. He knew that his internal organs and 13 meridians had already been invaded into a chaotic mess by this Zhenqi. Even the temple would not be able to save him. After understanding reality, he immediately accepted it. His dignity and state of mind as a great grandmaster made Ku He's expression very calm. He looked at the Qing emperor and gently sighed. His eyes had already seen through everything. Everyone had lost. They had lost to the other party's 20 years of enduring and disguise. This was a terrifying and respectable opponent. To be able to endure for so long and not let anyone catch wind of it, this made Ku He feel even more respect than the shocking truth that the Qing emperor was a great grandmaster. Ku He couldn't help but think of the numerous conversations he had with the Empress Dowager and the Emperor before he left Shangjing. At that time his grandson had a bad omen. However, Ku He had still floated over because he and Sigu Jian had made ample preparations. These two great grandmasters had not anticipated that the emperor would make a move. Every trick and scheme has ended up costing you your life. Ku He sighed gently. A smile of knowing his destiny rose to his face. Involuntarily, he quietly spat out a sentence that the child had recorded in a book. In terms of tenacity and endurance, of the millions of people in this world, there was no one with a heart stronger than the Qing emperors. Although he felt a glimmer of worry for his home, Ku He did not feel any regret losing to such an opponent. In the instant the emperor made his move, Wu Zhu tightened his grip on the metal drill and immediately put it down. Having done this 3 times, he finally let go of the metal drill and placed his hands behind his back. The black cloth on his face fluttered in the wind and rain of Dong Mountain. During the Grandmaster's battle, everyone on the mountaintop knelt on the ground and used the trembling of their bodies to express their respect. Only he stood coldly and even somewhat woodenly watching all of this from the sidelines. Ku He sat under the tree while Sigu Jian rang the bell. Wu Zhu tilted his head slightly. On his usually expressionless face, the corners of his lips couldn't help but twitch. The fact that the emperor was a great grandmaster would certainly shock the entire world. However, Wu Zhu still only tilted his head and looked calmly at the emperor through the black cloth like he was looking at a strange object. He did not look at him like he was the sun in the sky. In this instant, Wu Zhu seemed to remember something but seemed to immediately forget it. His brows furrowed in a rare moment as he remembered something Qin Pingping had once said. After the assassination in the Hanging Temple, Qin Pingping had smiled and said he was going to let Wu Zhu watch a show. In the end he did not see it. What show? A show of the emperor transforming into a great grandmaster? It looked like the secret that no one in the world knew had still been somewhat guessed by the old cripple closest to the emperor. But why did he have Wu Zhu put on this show? Wu Zhu began to think. He had many things he wanted to ask the emperor, but for a moment he didn't know where to start. He had so many thoughts that he couldn't pull out a thread. Furthermore, Dong Mountain was not truly calm. Although Ku He and Sigu Jian had been heavily injured, they were not dead. Given the emperor's personality, since he had revealed his final trump card, he would not leave anything behind. Thus, Wu Zhu broke off his thoughts and took a gentle step forward. His step made everyone present feel a glimmer of fear and alarm. Although no one knew who this mysterious black-clothed figure was, the attitudes of the great grandmasters earlier had already made it clear that he was also a grandmaster ace. In the current situation, if he suddenly attacked, the 4 great grandmasters, including the emperor, would probably all fall into pools of blood. Wu Zhu did not attack. He only looked calmly at the emperor. The real movement came from the depths of the ancient temple, at the end of the ruins, where the yellow cloth covering Sigu Jian suddenly moved. It was as if someone was trying to stand up under the yellow cloth. After losing an arm and suffering from the way of the emperor's punch, could Sigu Jian still stand up? Had a great grandmaster's body truly surpassed the limits of mortals? The emperor narrowed his eyes and looked in that direction. Everyone followed the emperor's gaze and looked in that direction. Ku He was no exception. However, the imperial advisor only smiled bitterly. The yellow cloth was forcefully torn apart. A young man covered in blood crawled out from under the cloth. As he coughed, he tore the yellow cloth into strips. His face was determined and calm. Although it was covered in blood, there was not a glimmer of panic. Although he coughed endlessly, he did not stop the movements of his hands. There were so many eyes on the summit of Dong Mountain, particularly powerful figures who far surpassed mortals, staring at him. However, it was as if he could not feel them at all. He only lowered his head and moved. He was not Sigu Jian. He was Sigu Jian's last disciple, 13th Wang. Once 13th Wang set his mind on something, he would do it. He had never cared what other people thought or how they would stop him. Thus, as a disciple of the Sword Hut, he had accepted Fan Xian's orders and resisted the rebel army at the mountain gate. He had been sent flying dozens of feet by Yi Luyun, but he still bravely climbed to the summit. He was prepared to continue completing his mission when he saw his teacher's right arm cut off and fall to the ground. Thus he stood out and tore apart the yellow cloth strips. He carried his heavily injured teacher on his back and used the strips of cloth to bind him tightly. With a crack, his right hand chopped off a thin beam on the ground. Holding it in his hand, he walked out of the door of the old temple and faced everyone on the summit. Sigu Jian lay on his disciple's body. A large, wretched hole had been punched through his abdomen. Fresh blood poured out and landed on 13th Wang's body. Immediately after, it dripped to the ground. There was a mournful smile on his face, but there was incomparable joy in it. He was on the body of his favorite disciple. 13th Wang, covered in blood, carried his blood-covered teacher. In an instant the yellow cloth strips were dyed bright red. He held the thin beam in his hand. There was not a glimmer of fear on his face. He only stared fiercely at the middle-aged man in dragon robes. His meaning was simple. He wanted to carry Sigu Jian down the mountain. Who would stop him? In the mouths of the storytellers of later generations, the battle on Dong Mountain that shocked the world and affected future generations was filled with too many strange changes and killings. The people who participated in this matter were all the most respected figures in the world. Thus, when they talked about it, they were particularly excited. Often they couldn't finish talking for 3 days and 3 nights. However, what they talked about in these 3 days and 3 nights was basically what happened in 1 second. In this second, the Qing Emperor suddenly attacked. Yi Luyun was heavily injured, and Ku He and Sigu Jian had no way out. All of the storytellers had forgotten a relatively minor character, 13th Wang. For one, they didn't know the truth of the end of the Dong Mountain battle. For another, compared to these great grandmasters, 13th Wang was an unremarkable character. Although the Qing Emperor had used up a great deal of vital energy, given his great grandmaster realm, if he wanted to kill 13th Wang, it would be as easy as lifting a hand. However, 13th Wang, this minor character, was still not afraid. He stared viciously into the Qing Emperor's eyes as he gripped the thin beam tightly in his hand. It was as if in the next moment he was going to use the wooden stick he had picked up on the ground to give the Qing Emperor a shock. Yi Luyun, with a large wound in his abdomen, sat cross-legged not far from the Qing Emperor's side, circulating his qi to heal. Looking at this scene, he couldn't help the glimmer of a smile full of admiration appearing at the corners of his lips. He sighed and said, "What a young man." Sitting cross-legged beside the broken tree, Ku He's bitter smile gradually became clear. No one knew if he was thinking of his true last disciple, Begonia Duo, who was naturally in harmony with nature. He smiled slightly and sighed in admiration. Talented people appear in every generation, and the way of heaven changes. This is the principle. The Qing Emperor looked calmly at the unfamiliar young man. A moment later he smiled slightly. Then he gently moved a step to the side and opened up a path for 13th Wang, who was carrying Sigu Jian on his back. As an emperor and a great grandmaster, he opened up a path for 13th Wang. The dying Sigu Jian opened his eyes with great difficulty and glanced at the emperor. Some blood seeped out of his lips. The ruthlessness in his weak voice was still there. "How is my disciple?" "Teacher, don't talk anymore." 13th Wang coaxed his teacher like he was a child. He did not immediately choose to go down the mountain after the Qing Emperor unexpectedly opened up a path. Instead, under everyone's shocked gazes, he walked to the Qing Emperor's side, lowered his body and picked up something. He picked it up naturally as if the Qing Emperor, who was shining brightly, did not exist. What he picked up was Sigu Jian's severed right arm and the normal sword. 13th Wang carried Sigu Jian on his back. In one hand he held a severed arm and a sword. In the other he used a thin beam as his usual green banner. Just like this, he disappeared from the stone path of Dong Mountain. A moment later, the faint sound of Sigu Jian's wild singing and wailing, as well as a ruthless and sorrowful laughter, echoed through the mountain valley and did not stop for a long time. The emperor could kill 13th Wang and not do anything. It was not because he valued talent. Rather, it was because he knew the relationship between this young man and Sigu Jian laughed and cried. How could he not know this? A dying great grandmaster, in his last moment, still wanted to see if the Qing Emperor would make any mistakes. The emperor had not made any mistakes. There was no need for him to destroy Dongyi's future ahead of time and separate himself from the Qing kingdom's future. Although 13th Wang's determined state of mind moved him, he still did not think much of this young man. He was as confident as ever, arrogant and confident. After today, no one dared to disrespect this confidence. The emperor knew that Sigu Jian was dead for sure. He knew what kind of damage a full-powered punch of the way of the emperor would bring. Even if Sigu Jian could linger on for a while, what did a bedridden great grandmaster with a severed arm count for? Of course, this was still not enough to explain why he would move out of the way. Given his personality, all enemies should be eliminated at the best opportunity. Fan Xian was also not the true reason he was considering. The true reason the emperor did not attack was because Wu Zhu had taken a step forward. Sigu Jian left. Ku He also left. He floated away. The imperial advisor of Northern Qi floated away to his homeland and painfully waited for the last few days of his life to be tormented. After this battle, 2 of the 4 great grandmasters in the world were gone. The power balance between the 3 powers had finally undergone an earth-shattering change. The biggest obstacle to the Qing kingdom unifying the world would no longer exist. It was not until Ku He had also left the summit of Dong Mountain did Wu Zhu slowly pull back his foot that had stepped forward and his silent threat. In the entire world, only Wu Zhu dared to threaten the Qing emperor at such a time. The Qing emperor looked at him calmly and warmly and said, "Lao Wu, I need an explanation from you." In front of Wu Zhu, the emperor naturally referred to him as Lao Wu and didn't refer to himself as emperor. Wu Zhu slowly lowered his head. A moment later he said, "I don't like it." This blind great-grandmaster had been recovering on the summit of Dong Mountain for over a year. He seemed to have remembered something. He became more and more talkative, and his expressions became more and more colorful. He was becoming more and more like a normal person. He also began to have emotions that a normal person should have, such as like and dislike. However, his emotions were rather extreme and did not match the coldness on his face. If he didn't like it, then he didn't like it. Who cared about unifying the world? Who cared about the shocking situation you spent 20 years building? If he didn't like it, then don't do it. Young master told me to protect your safety. Wu Zhu raised his head and looked at the emperor through the black cloth. You are safe now. It had been some time since he had called Fan young master. The Qing emperor's expression was calm. There was not a glimmer of anger. He knew that when Lao Wu and Yi Qingmei were in Dongyi, he had some old friendship with Sigu Jian. As for Ku he also knew that the young lady of the Fan family was still under Ku He's tutelage. However, those two great-grandmasters were already crippled and about to die. The Qing emperor was not worried about anything. Calmly he looked at Wu Zhu and said, "Lao Wu, come back to Jingdo with me." Wu Zhu lowered his head and thought for a moment. A moment later he raised it and said, "I remember some things, but I don't remember that person was you." That person was the person who had practiced the upper and lower scrolls of the nameless martial secret. When Fan Xian was young, Wu Zhu had once told him about it. However, he didn't remember who had practiced it. Only now did he remember that it was the Qing emperor. The black cloth on Wu Zhu's face appeared particularly straight. "Goodbye." Wu Zhu said this last goodbye to Yi Luyun, who was sitting cross-legged and healing. After saying this, he gripped the metal drill at his waist with one hand and calmly walked toward the stone steps, beginning to descend the mountain. He didn't say another word to the emperor. He also didn't express farewell to the old temple he had lived in for more than a year. He once again disappeared from the stone steps. Everyone had left. Only the emperor stood alone on the summit of the mountain. Ku He and Sigu Jian were certain to die today. The plan of many years had been realized. His grand ambition to unify the world was about to begin. However, there was not much joy on the emperor's face. He just stood quietly and welcomed the sun in the sky and the slightly damp sea breeze. He appeared somewhat lonely and desolate. It was lonely to be at the top. It was difficult to find someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with him. Regardless of who it was, in this instant, they would all feel a strange emotion. However, this kind of emotion did not last long. There were many people who had survived on the summit. Most of the officials who had come to worship heaven were still alive. More than half of the priests in the Qing temple had survived. Although the battle between the great masters was incomparably mysterious, it was strangely controlled within a perfect boundary, other than the last punch and the temples that had been crushed. Only now did the people on the summit shake off their shock. Given their eyesight, it was impossible for them to see clearly what had happened in that instant. Why was Sigu Jian's sword just about to pierce into the emperor's body when immediately after, Sigu Jian's body was sent flying back like a piece of useless rock? However, they at least knew one truth. The emperor had won. Furthermore, he had won unusually thoroughly. In front of the emperor's power, all schemes and tricks appeared weak and fragile. The future of the Qing kingdom would be like the red sun in the sky above the summit, never sinking. Their faces carried tears and ecstasy as they knelt to the ground and cried out, "Long live!" Amidst the cries, the emperor was calm. His expression did not change at all. To eunuch Yao, who was the first to stand, he quietly said, "Inform the foot of the mountain to begin, to act." Inform the director to begin. Yes. Send a secret edict to Yanjing. Order Mei Zhili to temporarily act as regent. Order the western camp to press toward the Song border. Order General Shi Fei to bring the edict earlier to the northern expedition camp in Sangzhou to take over the northern expedition army. Yes. Inform Xue Qing to select a number of able officials to go to Luozhou. Tell him that I will wait for him in Ho Yongji's manor. Yes. The emperor had not lost his head at all from today's great victory. Instead, he calmly gave out order after order. The news to Qin Pingping had to be the earliest and the Northern Expedition Army had to be controlled. As for Dongshan Road, as Eunuch Yao lowered his head in acknowledgement, he felt a chill in his heart. It was impossible for Dongshan Road not to know about such a dangerous matter as surrounding Dong Mountain. Governor Ho had probably long colluded with the eldest princess. It looked like the first governor to die a violent death since the founding of the Qin kingdom was going to fall on Ho Yongji's shoulders. All of Dongshan Road was probably going to be bathed in blood from top to bottom by the emperor. No wonder the emperor had Xue Qing travel thousands of li from Jiangnan to send good officials. After calmly and methodically setting up all of this, the Qing emperor finally let out a slow breath. He smiled self-mockingly and shook his head. He then walked in front of Yi Luyun and bowed respectfully. "Thank you for your hard work, Uncle Luyun." Without waiting for Yi Luyun to return the bow, he had already straightened his body and gazed in a daze at the ground that had long been washed clean. Hong Xixiang had died there, but he had not left any traces. For the sake of a noble goal, many people had willingly or passively given up their lives. Eunuch Hong was worthy of the Qing emperor's bow. The scene was a mess. However, the internal court had prepared a lot of things. Eunuch Yao led the officials whose legs were still weak and moved out some things from a side room that had never collapsed. He began to copy and stamp the seal. The emperor's royal seal had already been taken away by Sir Fan Jr., but the emperor's personal seal was still there. Since it was a secret edict, the personal seal was even more effective. After the first wash of the heavy rain, Dong Mountain welcomed the sun. A few white pigeons flew away from the summit of the mountain and circled a few times in the blue sky before flying off in all directions of the Qin kingdom. What they brought was not the news of the flood receding or the will of peace. Instead, it was the transmission of a powerful ruler's will. The flat summit of Dong Mountain had been calm until now. Suddenly, a massive rumble rang out. It didn't shake up any sand or stone, but it did raise some splashes of water. The entire area in the middle of the summit sunk 3 feet. It was as if a god had dropped a hammer and struck it. Only now did the true effect of a battle between great grandmasters reveal its terror and terror. As the two forces intersected, the compressed vital energy seeped into the world and forcefully collided with nature, changing the shape of the land. The emperor didn't look at the large pit. He only raised his head and watched the white pigeons fly in the sky and gradually fly further and further away. His expression was calm and incomparably confident. Chapter 578. The emperor issued a few secret edicts in succession. He then furrowed his brows and said something in a low voice to Eunuch Yao. Eunuch Yao was slightly startled, but his head was lowered very low, terrified of revealing even the slightest inappropriate emotion. The Qing emperor had used himself as bait to kill the two great grandmasters in the Dong Mountain situation. Naturally, he was prepared for everything that happened under heaven, such as the 5,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain and the rebellion that was about to happen in Jingdo. Since the eldest princess had the power to create such a large situation, she would not pass up the opportunity to control the Qin kingdom in one go. This opportunity was bestowed upon her by the emperor. Once the situation developed, if he wanted the Qin kingdom to maintain a stable development, it seemed that the emperor, far away in Dong Mountain, could only rush back to Jingdo and use his supreme authority to stabilize the situation in Jingdo. The emperor had long ambushed provincial soldiers in Jiangbei. It did not involve the movements of the Bureau of Military Affairs. It was all planned in secret with Xue Qing and the governor of Jiangbei Road. Naturally, it would not disturb the power of the Qin family. With such an ambush army, how could the 5,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain be enough? All of the conspirators saw the emperor as a fierce tiger in a trap. They did not think that this fierce tiger had actually been standing by the side of the trap the entire time, watching coldly as the hunters lost their footing. If the Qing emperor wanted to rush back to Jingdo and forcefully suppress the internal chaos, it would not be difficult. However, when the emperor and Qin Pingping had spoken twice by the palace pillars in front of the royal study and decided on this plan, he had never thought that once he finished the Dong Mountain matter, he would use the army to sweep through Dongshan Road and then return to court to tidy up state affairs. Although the Dong Mountain matter had happened by the seaside, its effects had spread throughout the entire Qin kingdom. For him, this was a rare opportunity. After a long period of planning, the main goal of the Dong Mountain matter was to remove the two biggest obstacles to the Qin kingdom's unification of the world. This was the so-called external threat. However, the external threat had been removed. What about the internal threat? This was an opportunity for the emperor. He would use his death to lure out all the restless elements in the court. Once the officials, who usually appeared to be incomparably loyal to him, knew of his death, would they still follow his final edict? Would they still have any respect for him? Would the little person hidden in the darkness and fog jump out now? Just as the emperor had always emphasized to Fan Xian and his sons, he valued people's hearts. The situation in Jingdo was, without question, the best opportunity to test people's hearts. The emperor stood in front of Yi Luyun, who was sitting cross-legged and healing. His expression was calm, but there were slight wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. What he said to Eunuch Yao was simple. He was going to send an edict to Qin Pingping to seal off the news. These were the two people the emperor trusted the most. The emperor wanted to see them one last time. Once Fan Xian and Yi Zhong passed this psychological test, they would obtain his absolute trust. However, the emperor on the peak of Dong Mountain had truly not thought that the situation in Jingdo would be so dangerous, that the people in the palace would be so hurt, and that his sister would be so powerful. Yi Luyun sighed and quietly said, "If we don't hurry back to Jingdo, I'm afraid there will be great chaos. In order to achieve great governance, there must first be great chaos. Using a storm of blood and wind to wash out the gold from the yellow sand and forge a united iron-like Qing kingdom could lay a good foundation for the war to unify the land in 2 or 3 years." The Qing emperor did not think much of such a price. However, he also did not underestimate his sister. He knew that if this happened, the entire Qing kingdom would probably sink into a storm. "I fought for this land," the emperor said coldly. "Even if Yunrui sits firmly in Jingdo, I can still fight back." After these words were said, the emperor didn't say anything more. After coughing, he slowly walked toward the blood-stained mountain gate at the foot of Dong Mountain with Eunuch Yao's support. The signal arrow had already been raised. The sounds of killing rang out again at the foot of the mountain. The officials and attendants accompanying the heaven worship came down the mountain with faces full of fear. A number of people had already made a stretcher. Humbly they helped Yi Luyun lie down. The transmission of information in this era was unusually slow. Qin Pingping, far away in Jingdo, had already arranged everything. The Overwatch Council was powerful enough to seal off any true information from Dong Mountain Road. The emperor had calculated that at the beginning of the rebellion, his proud and crazy sister would send news of his death back to Jingdo and push the entire situation into a crazy situation from which there was no way to recover. Since the eldest princess had started the Dong Mountain incident, regardless of whether the emperor was alive or dead, she had to handle all matters in Jingdo with the mentality that the emperor was already dead. This was the madness of staking everything on one throw. However, Ku He and Sigujian were still alive. The 5,000 rebel soldiers at the foot of the mountain and the Jiaozhou Navy rebel army on the sea could not be completely destroyed. At most, in another 7 days, the true situation at Dong Mountain would get out. Given the distance between the two places and the Overwatch Council's ability to seal off information along the way, in about 30 days, the people of Jingdo would know of this earth-shattering news. At that time, the eldest princess would presumably have already started for a dozen days. No one knew if Jingdo could be held. As the emperor walked silently down the mountain, he thought about all of this. Although he was confident, he still did not want his Jingdo or his Qing kingdom to see too much turmoil. Comparing the two, he was still willing to take a risk and see the sincerity hidden in the deepest parts of people. He wanted to see the power of people, particularly Fan Xian's. He wanted to see whether or not Fan Xian could understand the heart of a monarch and help the emperor guard his homeland. He had not thought that Fan Xian would fight a beautiful battle but be restrained by the eldest princess with even more beautiful methods. In the end, Fan Xian had guessed the emperor's thoughts. However, the methods he used to protect his Jingdo home were things the emperor had never expected or wanted to see. No matter how the emperor calculated, he still missed one thing. It was the Empress Dowager's attitude. This emperor, famous for his filial piety and known to rule the world through filial piety, had forgotten that his mother was actually like him. She would forever place the Qing kingdom and the survival of the royal family first. Other than his own life, it was more important. Before he went down the mountain, the emperor, who had just obtained the greatest success of his life, still calmly gave one last order: capture alive the leader of the rebel army at the foot of the mountain. Although the black-clothed man at the foot of the mountain was not a great grandmaster, he was another important figure in the Qing emperor's heart. Wang Qinian lowered his head and fled down the mountain through the dense forest in the wind and rain. Before Ku He's first palm landed on old eunuch Hong's chest, this Overwatch Council official, who had seen the opportunity quickly, had secretly slipped down the mountain while no one was paying attention. He was known as the Two Wings of the Overwatch Council. Back then he had been a great bandit who had swept through Dongyi and northern Qi. When he did this kind of sneaky action, it was truly sharp. The sharp edges of the leaves brushed past his body. Although they were unable to cut through the Overwatch Council's special robes, they still shocked him. He didn't know what would happen at the top of the mountain. He only knew that such a scene was not something someone of his level should be prying into or curious about. In his opinion, the Emperor was dead for sure. No one could survive the combined attack of 3 great grandmasters. Thus, he decided to flee at the first opportunity. His thoughts were simple. He had to send this shocking news to Jingdo at the first opportunity. Although he didn't know if he would be able to run into Fan Xian, who was also fleeing, he had to at least notify Director Chen. Jumping over a call, he cautiously used the wind, rain, and trees as cover. He had already come to the middle of the mountain without a sound. At this moment, he heard a muffled sound at the top of the mountain, followed by the sound of a bell. It was the moment the Qing Emperor had punched out with the way of the Emperor's killing fist, and Sigujian's heavily injured body crashed into the ancient temple's bronze bell. Wang Qinian paused and continued to lower his head. He hadn't walked for long when he felt some movement behind him. Unconsciously, he hid his body in a pile of weeds and watched the slanted stone path in the distance. 2 bloody people walked down the stone path. Wang Qinian was familiar with the young man. It was 13th Wang, whom he had interacted with for a long time in Jiangnan, who was on his back. Wang Qinian's eyes widened. Listening to the weak but comical conversation between the 2 bloody people, he finally knew who 13th Wang was carrying. The bloody person with the broken arm was 13th Wang's teacher. Wang Qinian was Fan Xian's most trusted aide. He even knew about the matter of the chest. Naturally, he also knew 13th Wang's true identity. 13th Wang was the last disciple of Dongyi's Sigujian. Then his teacher was Sigujian. Wang Qinian's shocked pupils constricted. He didn't even dare to breathe loudly. He could only calmly watch this strange and sorrowful pair of teacher and disciple walk down the stone steps step by step. A moment later he came back to his senses. He was still slightly absent-minded. He wondered what had happened on the summit of the mountain. Who in this world could injure Sigujian to such an extent? Before Wang Qinian could wake up from his shock, a hemp-clothed figure floated down the mountain in a strange posture. Wang Qinian looked at this scene and almost vomited blood. What was going on with Master Kuhi? Magic? Looking at this old bald donkey's face, why was it like a zombie's? 2 great grandmasters had walked past Wang Qinian's eyes one after another. Furthermore, they had left in such a dejected manner. Perhaps they had already discovered Wang Qinian's hiding like a field mouse. At this moment, how could the 2 great grandmasters who didn't have long to live have the energy to pay attention to him? However, Wang Qinian was extremely shocked. He couldn't understand how the 2 grandmasters, who had charged to the top of East Mountain like gods, could become like this in such a short time. After a long time, he straightened his body with trembling legs and turned his head toward the peak of Dong Mountain that rose into the clouds. He thought to himself, had the Emperor won? Perhaps he should return to the summit of the mountain to see what had happened. However, the shock in his heart and a faint sense of fear urged his legs to continue walking down the mountain. Past noon and into the night, the sounds of killing rose up from all directions at the foot of the mountain. Wang Qinian, who had been hiding in the darkness like a bat, finally took the opportunity to break out of the battlefield. He finally confirmed the reality that the Emperor was still alive and well. The rebellion had failed. The great grandmasters were doomed. He made a decision on his own. He would no longer follow the heaven worship procession. Instead, he ran toward Jingdo as fast as he could. He had to tell Fan Xian the truth of this matter and provide background information that Sir Fan Jr. could use for reference. Only then could he prevent Fan Xian from making an unforgivable mistake in Jingdo. Wang Qinian was an official of the Overwatch Council and an official of the Emperor. He was certain of only one identity. He was Fan Xian's trusted aide. He knew too many things about Fan Xian and too many thoughts. He was very afraid that Fan Xian would make some wrong decisions because of the Emperor's death. It was just like how the Jiaozhou Navy Admiral Su Maokai had advised Fan Xian to make a decision on the boat. For some reason, Wang Qinian guessed the Emperor's thoughts. He was terrified and worried for Fan Xian and everyone in Jingdo. Thus, he used the fastest speed and experienced countless twists and turns to rush back to Jingdo. He rushed ahead of the Overwatch Council and the eldest princess spies. Carrying this world-shaking news, he came to Qin Garden. He was the first person in the world to spread this news. In the end, he did not spread this news. The old cripple of the Overwatch Council had directly tied him up and gagged his mouth, not giving him any chance to spread the news. In the few days after the old cripple learned of the situation on Dong Mountain, he developed a new habit. He often sighed to his old servant. You have to know that it is not an easy thing to make a person die. When Wang Qinian prepared to slip down the mountaintop, Gouda had already slipped away. These trusted aides at Fan Xian's side had, without question, been infected with too much of Fan Xian's scent. They were different from most people in this world. In the depths of their hearts, they had already unconsciously begun to view their own lives as more important than the emperor's. In a society with imperial power, this was a rebellious thought. Although Fan Xian had never said it explicitly, the way he did things in secret from the court and the imperceptible influence he had on the words and actions of the people at his side all showed this point. When Gouda trembled as he fled down the mountain, he had certainly not thought of this. Like Wang Qinian, he did not see Sigu Jian and Ku He's heavily injured figures. However, he had discovered the truth of the matter at the foot of the mountain. He was afraid and terrified because his and Wang Qinian's identities were different. The officials of the Overwatch Council were the emperor's subjects, while the Tiger Guards were the emperor's servants, or perhaps the last layer of protection. Wang Qinian could run, but the Tiger Guards could not, particularly when the emperor's life was in danger. For the Tiger Guards, fleeing in the face of battle was a kind of humiliation and a monstrous crime. Perhaps Gouda could lessen the feeling of humiliation in his heart, but he could not avoid this crime. The stone path was covered with the bodies of the Tiger Guards and shattered blades. All of his colleagues had died on Dong Mountain. When he faintly understood the result of the assassination at the mountaintop, Gouda became angry, hurt, and afraid. 100 Tiger Guards had died just like that. When had the emperor ever cared about their lives? Gouda's heart was cold. He knew that he would never be able to return to the emperor's side. Once he showed himself, what awaited him would be the severe punishment of the Qing law and palace rules. Not only would he die, but perhaps even his family would be implicated. Thus he chose to flee even more resolutely. He trusted Fan Xian, but he could not return to Fan Xian's side because he didn't want to bring any trouble to Sir Fan Jr. He only wanted to leave the unfathomable royal palace and the emperor whose power could not be offended. He wanted to go to a distant place and live the rest of his life in peace. At the end of the Dong Mountain incident, 2 of Fan Xian's trusted aides chose their own paths. At the time it did not attract much attention. No one had even noticed this. But when it came to things like life, who could say anything about it? Every sip and every peck was destined. The cause sown today would bear a bitter fruit in the future. While Gouda and Wang Qinian were running on the road, the thousands of rebel soldiers at the foot of Dong Mountain and the 9th-level assassins in Dongyi were also on the road to escape. The Jiaozhou Navy ships on the sea had not yet entered the deep ocean when they were blocked off by the ships that Xiaozhou had sent over. Although the combined fighting power of the 2 provincial soldiers was far from that of Yan Xiaoyi's personal longbow soldiers, the most important thing in a battle between 2 armies was momentum. Ku He and Sigu Jian, 2 figures who were like gods in the hearts of common soldiers, had both met such a tragic end. What would these rebel soldiers who had betrayed the emperor think? When the emperor, wearing a bright yellow dragon robe, and Yi Luyun, who had been the protector of the Qing kingdom for decades, walked out of the mountain and appeared in front of the rebel soldiers, this rebellion had already come to an end. The military had not moved, but their morale had already been defeated. Thousands of rebel soldiers stood at the foot of Dong Mountain in fear and helplessness. The roads leading to the wilderness had already been surrounded by layers of provincial soldiers who had come on orders. They knew they had no way out, but they could not summon up the last of their courage to carry out the last struggle of their lives. His Majesty's words shattered everything they had. I will pardon you all from the death penalty. Regardless of whether they believed it or not, this was still a sweet, poisonous fruit. The rebel army abandoned their weapons and surrendered, but it was unknown how they would be massacred and cleansed in the next 2 years. When the provincial soldiers began to surround them before the Qing emperor had come down the mountain, the Qing emperor had not yet come down the mountain. After attacking the mountain, Yun Zhilan and a group of Dongyi assassins still had a dozen people left. They received Sigu Jian, who 13th Wang had bravely carried down from the mountain. Knowing the truth at the summit, they broke away from the rebel army with chills all over their bodies and began to kill their way into the woods in the north. Such a group indeed had a powerful killing power. They successfully broke through the perimeter and entered the secret mountain paths that used to be Danzhou. The Qing emperor was a person, not a god. Even if he could calculate everything, in order to give the eldest princess a chance and for the bigger picture, he could not take care of everything. There were too many cracks appearing within the Qing kingdom. It was a foolish dream to want to wipe out all the opposing forces in one fell swoop. He was not surprised by Dongyi's breakthrough. However, the Qing Emperor had given an order to the black-clothed commander of the rebel army because he was very interested in him. Even though he knew the chances of capturing him were not high, he still had to try. Master Ku He, with an inauspicious yellow face, was sitting behind the black-clothed man's horse and following him out of the encirclement. For a grandmaster to be so dispirited, a glimmer of sorrow flashed through the black-clothed man's eyes. Because of the Qing Emperor's order, the pursuit of the black-clothed commander was the strongest. Although the provincial soldiers were not very powerful and the Tiger Guards had all died, the Qing Emperor's troops finally succeeded in blocking the black-clothed commander at an intersection. It seemed to be a dead end. The other party had at least 300 soldiers. It seemed impossible to kill them all. The sounds of pursuit rose again from behind. The Qing Emperor wanted to capture him alive. Once he could not, so what if he killed him? The black-clothed man had led the Northern Expedition Army to surround the mountain. He had only brought 2 trusted soldiers. However, this person led unfamiliar subordinates and was able to divide and surround the Imperial Army, not allowing a single one of them to escape. It could truly be said that he was a godly commander. In the end, the momentum on the battlefield was like a landslide. Even if he had extraordinary abilities, he could not make Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers overcome the respect and fear they felt toward the Emperor and Yi Luyun. In the end, they still lost. Looking at the hundreds of soldiers in front of him, the black-clothed man, who had always appeared calm and gentle during the encirclement of the mountain, finally slowly straightened his body and carefully tied Master Ku He to his back. The 2 trusted soldiers beside him each held an object wrapped in cloth. After untying the layers of coarse cloth, they revealed a metal rod about the length of an arm inside. The black-clothed man calmly accepted it with both hands and put it together with a clang. With a wave of one hand, killing intent surged. A long, black metal spear suddenly appeared in his hand. With the spear in his hand, a powerful fighting spirit abruptly exploded from his calm eyes. His entire body also began to emanate a murderous aura. He was like a god of war. He squeezed the sides of his horse. Alone with Ku He on his back, he charged toward the 300 soldiers. His aura was like thunder and could not be stopped. It was as if he had returned to that night in Shangjing, when the rain fell as arrogantly. 2 of his trusted soldiers died, but he escaped with Ku He on his back, a provincial general reported in a trembling voice as he knelt in front of the Qing Emperor. Chapter 579. In just one night, the people who had come down from Dong Mountain had taken care of all the matters. For the first time in the history of the Qing kingdom, a rebellion in broad daylight had ended miserably. At least, the regicide had ended miserably and could not cause any more waves. Everyone, including the emperor, cold-blooded and slightly nervous, waited for the changes in Jingdo in a dozen days. The emperor was already very tired. Getting rid of the 2 great grandmasters, Ku He and Sigujien, was indeed the most beautiful page of his life, but it had also used up too much of his strength and spirit. Particularly after such a long plan had become reality, the influence it had on his spirit made him not as powerful as people appeared. In his life, this was actually his weakest and easiest time to be defeated. However, no one realized this. No one dared to take advantage of this. Other than surrounding Dong Mountain and sealing off the news, tens of thousands of provincial soldiers were also desperately chasing Dongyi and Northern Qi's 2 powers that had sneaked into the country. The tiger was dozing off, but he forcefully narrowed his eyes and flashed with a cold light, scaring those who dared to offend him into wretched prey. Shang Shanhu was alone and had to take Ku He to the north, so he was powerless to do anything. Although Yun Jilan, who was temporarily in charge of Dongyi's affairs, was also a master of swordsmanship, he was not a master of the art of war. He would not have thought that he would be able to turn back and seek some earth-shattering effect. This had nothing to do with courage. The Overwatch Council had already begun to move. The people from the 3 roads of inspections that had been arranged beforehand were densely spread out on every road from Dongshan Road to Jingdo. Although Chen Pingping was in Jingdo, his subordinates still displayed the powerful and glorious tradition of the Overwatch Council and displayed a terrifying ability to seal off information. Regardless of whether it was Shang Shanhu or Dongyi, even if they could send out information along the way to inform the eldest princess in Jingdo, they would not be able to do it within a few days. Additionally, they had taken a long detour to avoid being killed the entire way. When the truth of what happened at Dong Mountain reached Jingdo, it took 10 days longer than usual. The inconvenience of sending information brought Emperor Chen Pingping great convenience. Fan Xian was deep in the mountains carrying out his final battle with Yan Xiaoyi. He didn't know what had happened on Dong Mountain. After he had successfully killed Yan Xiaoyi, entered the Song Kingdom, and traveled south from Yanjing, the people who had escaped from Dong Mountain finally broke through the mountains and entered Dongyi's sphere of influence. Fan Xian's luck was not good. He had left the Song Kingdom a few days early, so he did not hear the news. Not long after he entered the Qing Kingdom, the commander of the Yanjing camp had already received a secret edict and secretly took over the leaderless Northern Expedition camp. At the same time, he forcefully separated the borders between the three countries. Strangely, regardless of whether it was the Northern Qi or Dongyi people returning, they all seemed to unconsciously close their mouths tightly. By the time the Northern Qi Emperor received the news, it was already very late. Even if he sent a message to the eldest princess in the south, it would be too late to change anything. Sigujian of Dongyi, this madman heavily injured and on the verge of death for some reason, did not try to notify Li Yunrui in Jingdo. The reason was actually very simple. Once the news that the emperor was not dead got back to Jingdo, the internal chaos in the Qing kingdom would probably end before it even began. The Qing kingdom's national strength would not suffer any losses. This was something Sigujian did not want to see. Sigujian had to consider what path Dongyi would take after his death. In order to delay the Qing emperor's steps in unifying the world, it was perhaps more in line with Dongyi's interests to let the eldest princess know a few days later that the emperor was not dead. If they could have the eldest princess cause a ruckus in Jingdo, the Qing kingdom's national strength would certainly be damaged. Once the battle started, it would take at least 2 or 3 years for the Qing kingdom to recover and send out troops. Yanjing and Sangzhou were already under strict lockdown. Not long after Fan Xian entered the capital, Jingdo was sealed. Even if Sigujian wanted to notify Li Yunrui, it would not be so simple. Most terrifyingly, the Qing emperor seemed to have calculated Sigujian's thoughts clearly. The thoughts of the great grandmasters were indeed interconnected. There was another important problem, which was Fan Xian's safety. As long as Fan Xian could successfully break through Yan Xiaoyi and return to Jingdo, Sigujian could not let Fan Xian die so early for the sake of Dongyi's future. In the last days of their lives, the great grandmasters had to consider even more, further and deeper things. They had lost the most important battle at the hands of the Qing emperor but had left their hope in the future. They had left it on Fan Xian, who no matter what could not be Dongyi's hope. These were all things that would only happen a dozen days later. The Qing emperor was not a precise calculator. He could only deduce a general possibility. Fortunately, the development of the situation was not too far from his analysis. After taking care of the matter at Dong Mountain, he did not stay at the foot of the mountain. Instead, he headed northwest through the night until he reached Luozhou. In the early hours of the morning, he entered the city and took up residence in Governor Ho Yongji's manor. That day the entire city of Luozhou was on lockdown. The provincial soldiers of Jiangbei Road, who had followed the emperor north, were ordered to take over the heavy responsibility of guarding the local provincial soldiers. A dozen officials and internal court eunuchs and aces took control of the entire manor. The people of Luozhou stared dumbfounded at everything in front of them. They didn't know where so many unfamiliar soldiers had suddenly come from. Furthermore, their gazes were unfriendly. They looked like wild beasts and carried a faint scent of blood on their bodies. It was clear that they had just come from the battlefield. The soldiers patrolled the streets of Luozhou, vigilantly watching everything around them. They brought a sense of solemnity to the largest city on Dongshan Road. It suppressed the common people so much that they no longer dared to whisper on the streets. Other than some essential matters, most of the time they retreated fearfully into their rooms. In the governor's manor of Dongshan Road, Governor Ho Yongji knelt before the emperor. He was not frightened, but his face was ashen. He kowtowed twice and did not say a word. He knew he was going to die, but he didn't know if he would be cut into 1,000 pieces or torn to shreds. He knew what would happen if he failed the moment he joined the eldest princess's plan. However, he did not expect that His Majesty would so easily resolve the situation at Dong Mountain. Before anyone could react, the emperor had pierced into the manor like a sharp arrow and landed right before him. The emperor did not look at him, and there was no disappointment on his face. He knew that the official kneeling at his feet would become the first Qing kingdom's governor-general to be executed in the past 30 years. He just counted the days coldly, trying to see if he could leave enough time for his sister. Luozhou city had become a dead city. No one could leave. Even though the eldest princess had planted spies in Dongshan Road, they had no idea what had happened in the manor. Some people outside the city had noticed the strange phenomenon in the city and began to send news back to Jingdo. However, every time they traveled a few dozen li, they would be killed by the Overwatch Council spies disguised as various characters. Qin Pingping had invested up to 40% of the Overwatch Council's manpower in these three areas. No wonder he was forced to lead the Jingdo garrison around Jingdo to engage in guerrilla warfare. For the sake of His Majesty's edict, the old director had gone all out. Just like that, he waited silently in Luozhou City for a few days. Estimating the time, the news of the emperor's death on Dong Mountain should have reached Jingdo, and Fan Xian should have arrived with the edict. Only then did the emperor's expression improve a little. After a few more days, the court sent urgent secret reports from Jingdo to the manors of the various provinces. The secret report regarding Dongshan Road and Luozhou Road arrived as quickly as possible. They began to question the truth of what had happened at Dong Mountain and seek confirmation. The emperor went through the procedures of the governor's manor and confirmed the news of his death. Then, he waited for the arrival of the procession from the court to receive his soul. The next day the court bulletin arrived again. It mentioned the crown prince and Fan Xian's assassination attempt on the emperor. All the governors submitted petitions and began to oppose the court. Other than the governors of Jiangbei and Jiangnan who knew the inside story, the governors of the other provinces were purely acting from the perspective of a high-ranking military official and a loyal subject of His Majesty. Although the emperor had not received the petitions from the other governors, he had a rough idea of what they would say. At this time he ordered someone to bring out Governor Ho Yongji of Dongshan Road. Slowly he said, "I have chosen the 7 of you to protect the world for me. 6 of them did not disappoint me. Only you." Ho Yongji had been imprisoned for many days and had not eaten or drank. He was exhausted. When he heard the emperor's words, he did not dare to beg for mercy. He knew that the day the emperor left Luozhou would be the day of his death. He only kowtowed with all his might, begging the emperor to spare his wife, children, and mother. The emperor looked at him coldly and did not say a word. The next day the emperor left Luozhou with the provincial army, ministers, and eunuchs. Before he left Luozhou, Ho Yongji was sentenced to death. His 3 children were beheaded, and all the people in the governor's office, as well as the officials from Dongshan Road who were held captive, were executed. The emperor was not a man who was easily angered, and he did not want to torture Ho Yongji who had betrayed the court with harsh punishments. In his opinion, killing a person was a necessary means for a ruler to retain power, and it had nothing to do with punishment. On the 6th day after receiving the crown prince's coronation announcement and Fan Xian's crimes, the emperor, who was slowly making his way from Luozhou to the capital, finally saw the procession that had come to receive him. Of course, the original purpose of this procession was to receive his body and soul. After coming into contact with the procession, the emperor gave an order coldly. The procession picked up its pace and continued to approach the capital. A few more days passed. The capital was still far away, and the emperor did not know what the current situation was in the capital. Qin Pingping and the emperor were like 2 wandering ghosts in the fields of the Qin kingdom, drifting in the air. They did not pay any attention to the task of gathering intelligence. However, the cooperation between these 2 wandering ghosts was too perfect, and they appeared to be too powerful. One day the emperor passed by the outskirts of Xinyang City. He looked at the unfamiliar city in the distance and said nothing. After a while, he turned his head and looked at the hearse behind the procession, and the huge coffin in the hearse, which was unknown in weight and layers. A self-deprecating smile appeared at the corners of his lips. "Tell Yunrui," the emperor said. Eunuch Yao, who was riding beside him, quickly took out a pen and paper and listened attentively. "I'm back," the emperor said coldly. Then he squeezed his horse's abdomen and rode ahead of the procession past Xinyang, heading toward the capital in the distance. The strings of the zither had already snapped, and the flowering tree had already been destroyed. The eldest princess, dressed in a rainbow dress, was standing in a daze by the lakeside of Taiping Courtyard, looking at the intelligence report she had just received in her hands. She completely ignored Fan Xian, who was sitting not far from her feet. From the beginning of the plan, she had already gradually moved her power from Xinyang to Jingdo. This process had taken 2 years. Including the dead Huang Yi and the living Yuan Hongdao, they had all moved from the Li Palace in Xinyang to Jingdo. However, on the stormy night before the new year, the emperor and Qin Pingping had only used an hour to completely wipe out the eldest princess' power. Presently, the eldest princess was mostly hidden behind the scenes in the rebellion, planning the overall situation and persuading the powerful people under heaven to take action. One reason was that she was good at this kind of role, and another was that she had no choice but to choose this role. She controlled the crown prince and the second prince, which was equivalent to controlling the Yi and Qin families. However, her own intelligence network had already received a fatal blow. Within 2 or 3 years, it would be impossible for it to recover. Thus, when she received the urgent intelligence report from Xinjiang, she couldn't help but furrow her brows and feel a glimmer of surprise. This intelligence report was fake. As the ruler of Xinjiang, Li Yunrui could tell at a glance that it was fake. However, this intelligence report was real, or it could be said that Xinjiang had already been completely controlled by someone, which was why they could use their own channels to send an urgent secret report to her. Who was it? Li Yunrui was surprised, curious, and hopeful. She tore open the sealed cover and swept her gaze lightly over it. Then her gaze focused on the paper. There were only 4 words on the paper, but these 4 words made her stare for a very, very long time. The emotions contained in her eyes were complicated, very complicated. These 4 words seemed to be reflected in her dark and bright eyes. As each word was typed out, it became the constriction and expansion of her pupils, the intensity of her gaze and the faintness of her gaze. First, there was a powerful shock in her eyes. Then there was a faint disappointment. Immediately after, there was an inexplicable anger. Shortly after, it turned into a faint self-mocking smile. In the end, like a stone falling into a lake, it gradually became calm. In just a moment, so many emotional changes had occurred in the eyes of the most beautiful and ruthless woman in Qin Kingdom. Fan Xian watched her quietly from the side, watching the change in her eyes. He did not see the craziness that terrified him. His heart was slightly at ease. Immediately after, with a thump, he guessed the contents of the letter. Even the Yi family's betrayal and his control of Jingdo had not made Li Yunrui lose her composure like this. Then, there was only one person in the world who could make her like this. Li Yunrui once again lowered her head and carefully read the 4 words on the paper. I have returned. The handwriting on the paper was strong and powerful. It was the emperor's handwriting. However, Li Yunrui could tell at a glance that this was eunuch Yao's writing. Although the emperor was a diligent ruler, he had to lead such a large country and handle so many memorials. He would still be mentally exhausted. Memorials that were not harmful were often given to eunuch Yao for approval. Over time, eunuch Yao had learned 90% of the emperor's handwriting. It was enough to fool the officials in court and the imperial censors. However, Li Yunrui had put a lot of thought into her brother. How could she not see the difference? She did not suspect that this was a lie. Someone had used eunuch Yao's handwriting to pretend that the emperor was still alive. She knew that other than the emperor, no one else would have thought of saying such simple and powerful words. The meaning of these words was very simple. I have returned. I'm still alive. Do as you see fit. 2 lines of tears fell from Li Yunrui's eyes without reason. This was an indescribable emotion that stimulated her tear ducts. It made this woman who loved to cry in front of the Empress Dowager, cry in this lonely Taiping courtyard. This was probably the Qing Emperor's last message to his sister. His last words, Li Yunrui thought sorrowfully in her heart. Did he disdain to personally write his last words? The emperor would never have thought that these words would make Li Yunrui feel so many emotions. He was only announcing his return as an emperor. Like a lion, he announced to the world that he had supreme authority over his territory. Fan Xian did not understand why the eldest princess was crying. There was not a hint of madness on this crazy woman's face. She was only sad and sad. No matter what, he would never have thought that the eldest princess would be angry and sad because the emperor did not personally write these words. Without question, the emperor and Fan Xian were both intelligent people, but they still could not understand women. For men, women were, without question, a completely different species, a stranger from a distant and unknown space. Li Yunrui weakly let go of her fingers. The paper floated down from between her fingers. Brushed by the early autumn wind, it landed on the small lake in the middle of Taiping courtyard. The paper was soaked in the lake water and immediately sank toward the surface. Startlingly, Fan Xian saw the words clearly. His heart filled with shock. Although he had thought of the possibility that the emperor was still alive after the Yi family rebelled, seeing it with his own eyes and confirming it, he still couldn't help but be shocked. He didn't know exactly what had happened on Dong Mountain. Since the emperor was still alive, the eldest princess had suffered a crushing defeat. Although she had said so earlier, Fan Xian knew that if she could destroy all the powerful men in the world in one fell swoop, that would be the most satisfying for her. This was the good news Fan Xian had been waiting for. If the emperor died, he was truly worried whether or not the Yi family would continue down this path. Fan Xian clenched his fists with difficulty, suppressing his excitement. Slowly standing, he gazed at Li Yunrui's back. He was worried whether or not this woman would give some crazy order after being provoked by this news. Li Yunrui gently clapped her hands. Many aces surged in around the small lake. Fan Xian swept his gaze over them and was not afraid. Perhaps these people summoned by Xinyang were terrifying in the eyes of a normal person, but they were nothing to him. He was only worried about Wan'er and Dabao. Unexpectedly, to Fan Xian's surprise and the shock of the subordinates, Li Yunrui's expression was calm. She slowly opened her mouth and said, "You can all leave. We don't need you here anymore." She paused for a moment and then said, "Hide your names and live out the rest of your lives in peace. Don't think about such laughable things as revenge." The subordinates were in an uproar. They looked at the eldest princess with disbelief and said in a pained voice, "Your Highness." From the moment Fan Xian stepped into Taiping courtyard, these people knew that a major problem had appeared in the Jingdo rebellion. However, they still had great confidence in the eldest princess. Li Yunrui only smiled indifferently and waved her hand. She didn't say anything more. "Your Highness." The subordinates knelt down in front of her on the small hill and around the small lake. They refused to leave. A few of them even began to cry. Fan Xian looked at this scene in shock. Although he knew that Li Yunrui had already given birth to the thought of ending her own life after the failure, which was why she had sent her subordinates away, he had not expected that these subordinates would be so loyal to her. He had very little contact with Xinyang and didn't know how the eldest princess controlled her subordinates. With the emperor's indulgence and Qin Pingping's help, he had more victories than losses in the battles against the eldest princess these 2 years. He couldn't help but feel a bit of contempt toward Li Yunrui. Seeing the crying subordinates unwilling to leave and feeling everyone's loyalty toward the eldest princess, only then did Fan Xian faintly understand something. For example, why this princess had so much power in court, why she could convince Ku He and Sigujian to act, why she could control the crown prince and second prince, why. This was just a feeling. He still didn't know where the eldest princess magic came from, but he knew that this was not an effect that could be achieved by peerless beauty. Unfortunately, Fan Xian didn't know in the past. It looked like he wouldn't have a chance to see the eldest princess' true power. There were cries all around. The eldest princess, who was by the lake, furrowed her brows slightly. Appearing slightly annoyed, she waved her hand again. A leading official looked at this scene and knew that the matter was over. Wiping away the tears at the corners of his eyes, he knelt down and kowtowed loudly. Resolutely he turned and left. When one person left, many others also left. Perhaps none of these people were greedy for life or afraid of death. However, since Li Yunrui had given the order and Her Highness was clearly unhappy, other than leaving, they had no other choice. Thus, only the eldest princess and Fan Xian were left in Taiping courtyard. Although it had been like this earlier, Fan Xian knew that there were many people watching him outside. Now that he knew those people had all left, his heart felt even more lonely. Looking at the eldest princess' thin shoulders, he felt slightly lost. Li Yunrui slowly turned around. Her 2 hands were placed elegantly on her abdomen. Her wide sleeves hung low, forming a beautiful and luxurious line. There was still a slight smile on her face, but her gaze was particularly clear. She was no longer the sinister figure in front of her enemies. She was no longer the weak person who was often slapped and cried in front of the Empress Dowager. She was no longer the stubborn, angry, and sorrowful sister under the Emperor's iron hand. She was the eldest princess. She was Li Yunrui, the one and only in the world. Li Yunrui looked at her son-in-law with a slight smile and said, "You don't seem to be as happy as I imagined to know that the Emperor is still alive." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly and said, "Recently, a lot of people have died. I can't be happy. So that's how it is. It looks like you really are like your mother." Li Yunrui stilled slightly and then smiled. She used an inexplicable emotion to end this topic. She turned and asked coolly, "Have you ever thought why the Qin family rebelled?" Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He didn't understand the meaning of these words. He also didn't know why, at such a time, she would suddenly mention the Qin family that had already been driven out of Jingdo by the Dingzhou army. The eldest princess glanced at him with a slightly mocking gaze and then sighed. She looked at the piece of paper that had already sunk to the bottom of the lake. The lake water of Taiping courtyard was extremely clear and shallow. The white paper gradually spread in the lake water like a piece of steamed bread that had been soaked in water. Countless red carps came forward to fight for it and the water churned. She watched this scene calmly and said, "In reality we are all fish. It's just that the things we fight for are not the same. This time I didn't get anything. I had thought I would be angry and disappointed. I was indeed angry and disappointed. In the end I realized that he is still alive. In the end I am still happy. Fan Xian thought with slight sorrow. Based on what the eldest princess had said earlier, she had already reached her goal in life. As for whether the emperor died or not, what did it matter? Since the emperor had returned, the eldest princess probably had no way out. Then he saw a scene that shocked him to the core. Li Yunrui's expression was calm and tranquil. She slowly lowered her arms. The light-colored wide sleeves of her palace robes hung down naturally and spread out. It was as if a great play had ended and an actor had walked out for the last time to express his thanks to the audience. The last actor was not only herself, but also a black poison dagger. This dagger was stuck deep into her abdomen, up to the hilt. Fan Xian's heart trembled. His entire body flew over and pushed her to the ground. He extended a hand toward her abdomen. I still have some scenes with the eldest princess tomorrow, so I can't bear to write any more. Yesterday the men's basketball team won, which gave me a lot of strength. Looking at the monthly vote rankings today, I found that during this period of time, the rankings have perfectly carried out the spirit of the Olympics. Everyone is chasing after each other. It is serious, nervous and lively. I haven't seen such a tense and interesting situation in a long time. The Olympics is about participation. Since I am participating, of course I have to work hard to fight for the top. If anyone has extra monthly votes, brothers and sisters who have seen my torment from these 20 chapters, please vote them for me. I'm very grateful. I won't say much about asking for votes, but at least I fulfilled my promise. Fan Xian pushed down the eldest princess. Ahem, don't slap my face. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.